From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Joe Biden set to hold a news conference 90 minutes from right now, wrapping the NATO summit in what could be a final test of his age and mental acuity, amid calls for him to drop out of the presidential race.
Those calls growing louder today on Capitol Hill, even as the Biden campaign meets with Democratic senators. We'll have the latest polling and reaction from our political panel.
All this despite good economic news for the White House today, with today's CPI showing core prices cooling to the slowest pace in 3 years. We're joined ahead by Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Kaylee, we've got a lot to cover in the next couple of hours, and by that I mean an extended edition of Balance of Power. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday on Bloomberg TV and radio. That news conference set for 5:30, then 6:30 appears to be closer to 7 when it does happen, Kaylee, at the conclusion, I should say, of the NATO summit. We'll have it for you live here on Bloomberg.
Yeah, it's going to be a critical night for President Biden and his reelection campaign, speaking to a number of constituencies this evening, not just addressing, of course, the NATO allies who have been gathered here in Washington for 3 days, but reporters who will ask questions he will have to ad-lib answers to, and of course all of the American people perhaps eager to watch his performance tonight, exactly 2 weeks to the day since that debate against Donald Trump that ignited all of these calls for him to step out of the race. And what's notable, Joe, is that this is happening on what should have been a good day for the Biden administration in terms of the economic data.
Well, and I'm sure that the chairman is going to tell us that it was. This is the type of inflation report that this White House, this president, has been waiting months, if not years, for. And it does have the markets thinking that we're in for an interest rate cut as soon as September.
Yeah, of course, the cooling in inflation that we saw in June came on the back of a long-awaited slowdown in housing costs, and a welcome sign for both the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve. Michael Gapin of Bank of America Securities reacted to the data earlier today.
This is unambiguously good news for the Fed, and it's unambiguously good news for the outlook that the Fed will be cutting. So a deceleration in shelter, a deceleration in non-shelter services, and another month of decline in core goods. So it's all good across the board.
Joining us now with more from the White House North Lawn is Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, welcome back to Bloomberg. Always great to have you on an inflation day. I'm sure you're feeling pretty good on this CPI day, especially because this is not a cooling in CPI in isolation. We have now seen this for a few months in a row. We're just trying to figure out how long it takes to establish a firm pattern. Are you confident July and August will show the same?
I think there's some positive momentum in that regard, and I'll speak to that. We actually wrote about that this morning, so I have some insights to share with you. But let me say something listening to your roll up to this spot. Yes, I understand that the Federal Reserve and the path of the forecast is important, and you know, for that matter, how the White House takes all of this in. But at the beginning and at the end of the day, the key people we're thinking about when we get a report like this, where prices actually came down a touch in June, and where prices fell for gas, for appliances, for electricity, for new and used cars, we're thinking about American consumers. We're thinking about people sitting around a kitchen table just like the one Joe Biden grew up at, where these issues about family budgets are absolutely critical. You know, groceries. Grocery prices have been flat or falling since the beginning of the year. So we keep in mind who our main constituency here is, and that's the American people. Households that are still dealing with prices that are too high, but as you suggested, moving in the right direction and with some real momentum.
At what point can you say that you've got this problem licked, Mr. Chairman? You've got a great piece of news here. Is the answer, as Kaylee referenced, 3 months makes a trend?
You know, I think one of the key trends here that we haven't talked about that's obviously very closely related to this, and it gets to your question, Joe, is what's happening with real pay, with the paycheck, with the buying power of pay. Now, we know that in June, the pay for middle and low wage workers in real terms went up 1%. But guess what? That is month 16 consecutive months wherein year-over-year real wages for middle wage workers have gone up. That's the kind of trend that gives people more buying power, a little bit more breathing room, and as I said, not just lower inflation, but actual price declines in some key budget areas, including gas, which was a pretty big negative in this report.
Well, that's absolutely true. You saw that downward pressure in energy costs, but we know there's still a hot war in the Middle East. Jared, we were speaking with your colleague at the White House, Amos Hochstein, earlier this afternoon, on Bloomberg about whether or not we could still potentially see risk of prices spiking once again. Is that the area in which you think we are most at risk of seeing a reinflationary spike, or is it elsewhere?
Well, you know, obviously food and energy are taken out of the core because they're so volatile. I think it's really notable the fact that the gas price has been low and stable at a time when there's been the conflict that you talked to Amos about earlier. That really says something, and part of that is because the U.S. is such an important producer of energy, actually both traditional sources and renewables. Really big progress in both of those. But when it comes to the core, you know, we break that down into three parts: housing, core services, ex-housing, and core goods. Now, core goods have been decelerating for a while. There's been deflation there, and there was again in June. We've seen that in a bit of pattern. Housing, as you mentioned, though, that's been kind of a waiting for Godot story, and we think that some of those lags may have finally played out a bit. And, you know, 1 month doesn't a new trend make. But we do see some evidence that the expectation that declining rental inflation would finally work its way into the CPI. That did happen in June. We'll have to see if that persists.
Jared, I want to ask you about an exchange that took place. I know we're not going to talk about the Fed, and I'm not going to pull you into Fed policy, but when Jay Powell was testifying this week on Capitol Hill, it was the second day, or the first day rather, the second day in the House. Congressman Mike Lawler asked the chair about his interactions with President Biden. You might have seen this during testimony. Let's listen.
The last public meeting between you and President Biden occurred on May 31st, 2022. Does that sound accurate?
I'm going to take your word for it.
Okay. Have you had any private meetings with the president since that time?
No.
Any phone calls with the president?
Nope. I don't believe so. I've been at the Fed this is my 13th year, and I think there can go by long periods of time when the Fed chair doesn't meet with the president, and that's totally fine.
So, Jared, Chair Powell there making the point that that is unremarkable. I wonder your thoughts on that. Is that a typical cadence, or should it be for meetings between the president and the Fed chair? And how often do you meet with Joe Biden?
Well, let's start with the latter part, which I know much better. And the answer to that is frequently, very much a different scenario, as you'd expect. We just heard from Chair Powell. Frequently talk on the phone, frequently meet together in the Oval Office, and almost invariably to go over reports like the one we just got today. And I haven't had a chance to brief him on this report yet because he's been wound up with NATO, but I will. And when we do, when we sit down to have that briefing, I can tell you that the pattern has been one that's lasted decades now. I worked with, as you said, I worked with the president. We was the vice president. We always have great briefings. He always asks tough, sharp questions. That hasn't changed one bit. Over the years, our conversations tend to be somewhat not unlike what you and I and Kayleigh have been talking about. He wants to know what's the market reaction, what's this going to be, how's this going to be experienced by consumers, how is this translating as a kitchen table issue, how are folks feeling about this. We even might talk about interest rate paths. That's something he's obviously interested in. And those conversations have been ongoing as recently as, a few days ago. And the president is sharp and as acute as ever.
So the president's watching the stock market after all? Is that what we learned today?
Yeah, the stock market, I think his view is similar to mine. The stock market is not the economy, but it's not the economy. I think that's a Joe Weisenthal quote, by the way. I mean, if I come into the if I go to the president and I say, great day on the S&P 500, another record, he's going to say, calm down. Tell me what this means for working families. To what extent, every piece of good news or bad news is filtered through to the extent that it impacts, again, families like the one he grew up in. It's a tangible, feel it in your bones, and it's the same, again, the same persistence that I've always seen with this president, mapping these economic reports on into how people experience them. That's key for him.
Well, and Jared, we do appreciate you sharing the pattern you have seen consistently from President Biden, even beyond his years as president, over decades, as you say. I think the question on the minds, though, of us journalists, of American voters everywhere, is whether that can sustain for another 4 years plus. Are you confident that that sharpness can continue through a second term?
I am. I mean, I've seen it continue, as you've mentioned, through decades of work with this president. Even when he was in between vice president and president, he and I kept up on these issues. And we've always had, as I said, a deep and I think quite penetrating conversations that always made the connection. It's funny. It's the one I started with in our conversation where you guys totally understandably are like, what's this going to be for the Fed, the markets, you know, the White House? Our focus has always been on working families, on middle-class families. The president has consistently stressed to me that we need to make sure we have the connective tissue in place, the policy agenda that connects overall growth to the well-being of working families. You know, I've always thought a concise definition of Bidenomics is if you're helping to bake the pie, you ought to get a fair slice. And I think that characterizes a lot of our conversations.
I like that. Jared, thank you. It's good to see you. White House Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Jared Bernstein from the North Lawn here on Balance of Power. And coming up, President Biden's news conference set for the next hour or two. We'll see how this times out. Members of his staff making efforts to tamp down these concerns we've been discussing, concerns among lawmakers, voters, and donors. Our reporter roundtable is next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Some of my concerns are allayed. Some others have been deepened. I need more of the kind of analytics that show the path to success. Joe Biden has to go to the American people, not just in one meeting, one press conference, one speech, but consistently and constantly. Tonight will be important. The press conference will be potentially a turning point.
That was Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat, following a meeting between Senate Democrats and high-ranking members of President Biden's staff. Let's bring in our panel today ahead of the news conference that's set for an hour or two from now, depending on the schedule. Bloomberg's Peggy Collins and Gregory Korte are with us at the table. It's great to have you both here. Everyone is watching. The world is going to be watching Joe Biden. I can only imagine the ratings that this news conference is going to get. Unusual for a presidential conversation with reporters. But throughout the day, Kaylee and I have been talking to some of our most trusted Democratic and Republican analysts here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And the consensus has been that tonight doesn't actually matter, that this campaign is already over. Peggy, what are you hearing?
I think tonight matters because it is in some ways a make or break moment for the people, those senators and congresspeople, particularly Democrats, who are trying to weigh how far and how public do we go in trying to say President Biden should step out of the race. So I think it's another data point, as we like to say at Bloomberg. So a ton of pressure on the president. But as you can see, what are we talking about tonight at the end of NATO? We're talking about Biden, whether or not he can get through a press conference. We're not talking about some of the issues that were discussed among the leaders this week, like China, like Ukraine. So I think that's another big issue that the Democrats are facing, because this is what people are talking about, and this is what people are waiting for when Biden comes out to speak.
Well, but there are some Democrats who aren't even waiting to see how he does this evening. Just in the last hour and change, we've had 3 more House lawmakers, Gregory, call for him to step down. And of course, we've had at least one Democratic senator in Peter Welch of Vermont writing a relatively scathing op-ed in some sense in the Washington Post, saying that we cannot unsee President Biden's disastrous debate performance. We cannot ignore or dismiss the valid questions raised since that night. It's been 2 weeks. And if he still thinks the questions that night raised remain unanswered, can Biden realistically answer them and shift the tide this evening?
Yeah, it's been a real drip, drip, drip of bad news for the president in terms of people calling for him to step aside. You mentioned members of Congress. Perhaps the most damaging this week has been George Clooney, right, who's not a politician, but probably that's the kind of name that will break through all the sort of political chatter that a lot of people are tuning out in early July. And so, yeah, I agree with Peggy. This does matter. But let's also keep it in context. The names of Democrats who have called for the president to step aside at the convention, it's less than 10% of the party so far. Far greater. The sort of the critical mass of the party right now is in the camp of, as you heard from Senator Blumenthal, as we've heard from many, many members of Congress, of governors, to say, look, I support Joe Biden. I've always supported Joe Biden, but we need to see more from him. And that's putting even more pressure on this press conference tonight.
So, yeah, we're at, 13 lawmakers. So this with another 200, to your point. But there is reporting, Peggy, that there are a lot of lawmakers who have already written their statements, and they're waiting for NATO to end out of respect to the president. There are 31 world leaders in town. He's got an important news conference, as we've already established. What's tomorrow going to look like?
Well, I think tomorrow will be a big day because they will have more to say in terms of how President Biden does on screen tonight.
They're more free to speak.
Exactly. But I will say, we thought going into this week that there would be a number of people who would hold firm behind the president because we have so many world leaders here this week. But even this week, as you were both saying, we've seen more and more people come out and question whether or not he can make it not only to November, but the next 4 years. So I think that backdrop is important, that even with world leaders here, people are still dripping out and making question after question about whether or not this can work.
Well, and there's also the question of when that decision needs to be made, because the Republican convention is next week, Gregory. We still have a few more weeks to go until the Democratic convention. So theoretically, that's really your deadline. But even if President Biden were to come to the decision to drop out, would he likely do that before the RNC begins? Or is this something that he's going to let the opportunity for Donald Trump and all of the Republicans to attack someone else who could take the mantle pass by first before he ultimately decides?
Yeah, traditionally in our American system, when one party is having their convention, the other side sort of, takes a back seat and lets the other side have their moment, and the Democrats will have their moment at their convention. So I guess the question, and you could frame it as what will happen first, Biden sort of changing his mind, or Donald Trump finally making this vice presidential running mate decision that he's been teasing nonstop for months and months. The decision has to be made soon, I would think, but there's still also the potential that Democrats will move up this decision by having that virtual roll call vote, by not waiting even to the convention, doing something in late July to sort of rip off the Band-Aid and to make clear to the world that Biden is going to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, and that there's really nothing that can be done to change that, and get voters to focus on the fact that this is, as it has always been for the past couple of years, really comes down to a decision between two men who have both held the presidency and whose records voters can put side by side and have a rematch of 2020.
Peggy, quickly, what's your expectations tonight? Do we get a lengthy news conference? Does he want to show his ability to have a long duration conversation, or is it about being sharp with his answers?
I think it's sharp with the answers, but also not too short. I think if he comes out and only takes a couple of questions and exits stage left, as they say, that will raise too many questions about does he have the endurance. And so I think it has to at least be medium long for it to have legitimacy and for people to start to focus on the issues that they've been talking about all this time, like the economy and immigration. We're not talking about any of those issues anymore.
Whether it's medium, long or short, we're going to have full coverage of it for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg's Peggy Collins and Gregory Korte, thank you both so much for joining us. Now, still ahead, he is, after all, speaking at the NATO summit, and the U.S. announced a $225 million weapons package for Ukraine aimed at shoring up the country's air defense systems today. We'll have details ahead with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. While the focus tonight will be on President Biden's press conference at the NATO summit, which is scheduled to begin just over 1 hour from now, this week's meeting of 32 allies here in Washington did yield some deliverables. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall was at the summit site earlier and is back with more. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. President Biden announced today a $225 million assistance package for Ukraine. He sat down with Ukrainian President Zelensky for a meeting at the summit earlier, where he pledged the U.S. and NATO partners will stand by their ally.
And we're working with our NATO allies to ensure Ukraine is flying F-16s this summer. And we show the world that we stand with Ukraine now and in the future. So, Mr. President, thank you again for being here. We got a lot of work to do together.
You heard the president mention F-16s there. Those didn't make it into this iteration of the deal, but they are considered a longer-term goal for Ukraine. This package does include a Patriot missile battery and surface-to-air missile systems. Ukraine deems both of those critical to their efforts on the battlefield. Here's how one expert explained the importance of this aid to both of you here on Balance of Power earlier this week.
This is a very significant investment. What we don't know exactly is what version of the Patriot system these are, where they're coming from, so how long it will take. And in terms of impact, it really depends on how they're going to use them. And I have some questions about that, particularly given F-16s might be arriving in the country.
This marks the 8th security assistance package to Ukraine under the Biden administration. The State Department says the U.S. has sent nearly $51 billion in military assistance since Russia invaded the country in 2022. When it comes to getting these supplies out, I sat down with the Army's chief weapons buyer last month, Doug Bush. He told me the war in Ukraine has spurred a push by the Pentagon to revitalize the defense industrial base here at home.
We need it for ourselves, too. So we want to increase our ability both right now to replenish quickly, but also to support allies, Ukraine, but also other allies who might be wanting to use our production capacity to build their own stocks.
He went on to tell me recent investment in factory capacity is part of a generational change to modernize defense manufacturing as demand grows to send weapons abroad to allies like Ukraine. Sales of U.S. military equipment are hitting record highs. Last year saw $238 billion in sales. Joe and Kaylee, State Department data shows that's a 16% increase from the year prior.
So, Tyler, what about the big question hanging over this NATO summit, and that's membership for Ukraine? What did we learn?
Right. Well, NATO allies said that Ukraine is on a, quote, irreversible path to membership once the war with Russia ends. They then also went on to commit to a broader, longer-term security assistance for the country. Now, as you know, Bloomberg Television's Emory traveled to Kyiv and sat down with Ukrainian President Zelensky earlier this month, and he told her that he wasn't expecting a formal invitation into the alliance, but that he wanted to see some more concrete steps on how the country could get there. This seems to be a more firmer commitment than we've seen before.
Yeah, that's great. Tyler, thanks for the reporting. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. You can always count on the policy to come with the politics here on Balance of Power. Coming up, President Biden giving a news conference closing out the 2024 NATO summit. We'll have more on that coming up next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It was constructive. I was grateful that we had that much time to have a good and open and constructive conversation with the core team of the Biden-Harris reelection campaign. I thought it went well. I'm glad we had the conversation. I'm looking forward to a great press conference for our president tonight.
An ally of Joe Biden, Democratic Senator Chris Coons there of Delaware, speaking earlier today after Senate Democrats met with President Biden's top campaign advisors. In about an hour, maybe more from now, the president will deliver the news conference we've been talking about for days, closing out the NATO summit here in Washington. And joining us now to talk about the stakes is Andra Gillespie, political science professor at Emory University. Professor, it's great to have you back. Even with what we just heard from Senator Coons, there's new polling out today from the Washington Post, ABC News, and Ipsos. It finds a majority of Democrats, 56%, think Joe Biden should end his candidacy. And overall, 2 out of 3 adults think Joe Biden should step aside. Are you of the opinion that he can still correct course here Or is it too late for people to forget that debate?
Well, I think it's too early to predict what President Biden is going to do. I think that there is still a window in which he thinks he can make a decision. And I think we're going to have to wait to see until after the NATO summit whether or not we see more people come out and put pressure on him to drop out of the race. If that happens, it's something that he's definitely going to have to consider.
Well, it raises the question of what pressure matters the most if it is going to take Democratic leadership, for example, like the leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, or the Democratic part of the House, rather. He was speaking with reporters about the conversations going on within his caucus regarding President Biden earlier today and had this to say.
House Democrats are engaged in conversations with House Democrats at this moment in time. Those conversations have been candid, clear-eyed, and comprehensive. And that's important for us to do as a House Democratic Caucus family. And as long as those conversations are ongoing, I'm going to respect the sanctity of those conversations until we conclude that process.
He also, in his remarks, Andra, said that Biden is not a liability and Democrats will take back the House. Is this as much about Joe Biden's electability or whether or not the balance of the Senate and the House may go down with him if he doesn't win in November?
It's all inclusive. So there are certainly House Democrats who are in competitive districts and senators who are in competitive contests who are worried that there would be down ballot effects of people being demoralized and not showing up to vote, who would otherwise vote Democratic for president and probably vote Democratic in down ballot elections. And then there just is the general kind of realization that in a polarized age, you see a lot of straight ticket voting. And so people are worried about what the mobilization and turnout effects could be if Joe Biden stays on the ticket and people have lost confidence in him. What President Biden is looking at is that while his poll numbers have dropped, they haven't dropped to the point, because of the sample sizes of the surveys that we're looking at, to the point that we can start talking about statistically significant drops. The trend line nationally has certainly been negative since the debate. That is what donors, that is what Democratic elites are worried about. And they're also worried about what would happen if you had another bad sort of episode where President Biden lost his train of thought or looked confused, leading closer to an election where there is no time to correct course. And so these are the things that people are looking at. And this is why President Biden's press conference tonight is so critical. People are going to be paying attention to his verbal performance, whether or not he makes any major gaffes. And even if he comes through this particular performance with flying colors, the narrative has already set and gelled in the minds of many people. So there are already going to be people who are not going to be convinced one way or the other. That's what they're concerned about. And I think the interesting thing about the surveys is that there's the vote survey question, right, which Biden is holding on to. And then everybody else is looking at the increase in the past 2 weeks of the number of respondents, especially Democratic respondents, who are saying that Biden is too old. And that's what they're paying attention to. And they're wondering what the sort of long-term effects that's going to have on the vote.
Professor, speak to the potency of age in politics, because we keep hearing Democrats ask why no Republicans are calling on Donald Trump, a convicted felon, to drop out of the presidential race. Yet Joe Biden can't get through 2 words without a Democrat writing an op-ed or somebody in Hollywood telling him to cancel his ambitions in this case. Why is it that there is no equivalency in the eyes of Americans, politically speaking?
Because the media narrative had already been constructed to question Joe Biden's fitness for office on the basis of his age. So yes, we're looking at 2 men who are, only a few years apart in age. We are looking at somebody like Donald Trump, who has made his own verbal gaffes and had his own senior moments in the election. But the media narrative had already been constructed about Joe Biden perhaps slipping. In part, this is just due to perhaps some innate biases, but because he's the older of the 2 two candidates. Also, Joe Biden has a history of having made verbal gaffes before. So that narrative had been constructed. And when Biden had that terrible debate performance, it only confirmed the rumors and the discussion that had already been underway about him. And Donald Trump has been impervious to that because there are other media narratives that had already been written about him. So, for instance, the felony convictions do matter, right? Because that is certainly part of a media narrative about Donald Trump, perhaps not having the same ethical compass that other candidates have had in the past.
Well, Andra, this particular media organization at Bloomberg, there are other narratives we focus on as well, including, say, the economy. We got cool CPI data today that any other day would have been great news for the Biden administration, as we have talked extensively up until a few weeks ago during this election cycle about one of his biggest weaknesses, not necessarily being his age, but voter dissatisfaction with the economy. If the economy is getting better the closer we get to November, but these age questions remain, does that part of it even matter?
I mean, it's certainly going to take time for voters to sort of see this and feel this. The problem that the Biden campaign has had is that even though numbers have been trending in a more positive direction for months, people didn't necessarily feel it on the ground. And so because they didn't feel it, because they weren't observing it in their communities, they tended not to give Biden credit for this. And that's an especially difficult challenge in an era of hyperpolarization. So in an era where there are going to be people who are going to be predisposed to not giving this Democratic administration any credit for anything because they happen to not share the same partisan identification, that was only compounded by the fact that they didn't necessarily feel what these numbers are saying. So I think the larger question is, does that actually change people's perceptions? And then we can think about how those perceptions impact vote choice.
Professor, you point to the media narrative around Joe Biden. Have we set the bar too high for him to clear?
I think that there are going to be naysayers. And so as long as those naysayers are public, they've actually reinforced the existing media narrative. But, you know, this is a somewhat unprecedented position. We've had presidents who have had major health issues that should have, you know, questioned their ability to be able to perform their duties as president. You know, Woodrow Wilson comes to mind after he had a stroke. But Woodrow Wilson wasn't president and wasn't running for office, first of all, and he wasn't serving as president during a time where you got this type of intense media scrutiny. And so it puts Joe Biden in a unique position. And the truth is, people are trying to sort of figure this out in real time without a lot of historical equivalents. So we could talk about, you know, LBJ dropping out in 1968. It wasn't for health reasons. There are some lessons I think we can glean from that, but we have to acknowledge that the context is a little bit different. And this context where we're actually talking about mental decline and fitness to be able to run for office is certainly something that's different, in addition to the fact that we're talking about, at the moment, two incumbents running against each other, one of whom, you know, was in the unprecedented state of having been convicted of felonies in the state of New York.
What a world we live in. Andra Gillespie, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate your time. Now, still ahead, we're less than an hour away from President Biden's press conference, and we'll have more with our political panel on what it could mean for his campaign. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I do not think he can defeat Donald Trump. His age issue makes him the issue and not Donald Trump. And I think so long as he is the issue and Donald Trump is not, and his policies are not the issue, I think then Joe Biden loses. If you want to see Donald Trump not return to the Oval Office for a second term, I do think it's incumbent upon the Democrats to find somebody else. And I think Joe Biden should step aside.
That was Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, earlier, while President Biden is speaking now at the NATO summit. Let's take a listen to a few of his remarks.
Brings all those countries together in a unified, coordinated, and comprehensive architecture to support Ukraine, not just for now, but for years in the future. In the short term, we'll continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons, munitions, and training they need to repel Russian forces. In the medium term, we'll help build a future force that has the strength and the capabilities both to defend Ukraine and to deter further aggression. In the long term, after this war is over, if Putin ever tries it again, all the countries that endorsed the compact have pledged to have Ukraine's back, just like we have it now. You heard me say it before. We're building a bridge to NATO for Ukraine, a pathway leading to an eventual membership as they continue to implement important domestic reforms. This compact, which is on the stage here, is a central piece of that bridge. What happens to Ukraine matters. It matters to all of Europe. It matters to NATO. Quite frankly, it matters to the whole world. We're united against Putin's senseless and brutal war. We are united behind Ukraine as it fights to defend its freedom and its future. We're united behind a vision of the world where free countries like Ukraine do not have to fear aggression from a brutal tyrant next door. I want to commend you, Ukrainian armed forces, as their defense secretary leaders are here as well, and the Ukrainian people. You're incredible. And through all of your country, you're incredible. Their courage, the determination, the sacrifices they've made. And I commend all the nations that stepped up when it counted to stand with Ukraine. I've said before, Russia will not prevail in this war. Ukraine will prevail in this war. And we'll stand with them every single step of the way. That's what the compact says, loudly and clearly. And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mr. President, dear our friends of Ukraine.
President Zelensky now speaking live at an event on the Ukraine Compact as part of this NATO summit, its final day, gearing up towards Joe Biden's news conference that's set to follow here, and it is running late. We understand it could go well past 6:30 on its start time, but an interesting moment there as we prepare to assemble our panel as Joe Biden, handing the microphone over to President Zelensky, called him President Putin. He quickly realized the mistake and corrected himself, but these are the kind of moments that we've been hearing so much concern about, even if it's something that any of us might have done. Our political panel is with us now. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner, and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's great to have both of you with us here. Did your heart miss a beat there, Jeanne, toward the end? Talk to us about the impact of moments like these.
Yeah, I mean, normally when somebody has a misstep or a misstatement, which we all do, it's not uncommon. We would simply just look away, not think much about it. But in this environment, every single misstatement, misstep he has becomes a large story. And that is the environment in which we're in because of the way that he performed, not just at the debate, but what we're hearing about in reports, because of the way he has performed in the times he's been in public and with other people. So it's these kinds of performative issues, not necessarily what he has done or what he is doing. I mean, arguably, here is a president who has done more to strengthen our NATO alliance than any modern president. And the amount of support that he has given President Zelensky in Ukraine is commendable. It's something that so many people are grateful for around the world. And yet so much of what he says and does these days is shrouded in this question of his age and his cognitive abilities. And so, yeah, your heart does skip a beat every time this happens now.
Well, and it makes you wonder how many heart palpitations people inside the Biden campaign or just the Democratic Party are going to have over the course of this press conference this evening, whenever it begins. I guess the question, Rick, is it really going to make a difference? Even if his performance is stellar, near perfection tonight, is that enough?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's enough. I mean, the reality is, since Joe Biden announced his reelection, there have been doubts cast by the voters about his ability to take another term, 4 more years, at the age that he's at. And he's actually aged an extra year during the course of that time. And so there's fundamental aspects of this that have nothing to do with the performative aspects of being president. He has been behind Trump for the burden of this campaign since he basically locked up the nomination. And more than 50% of his own party has raised questions about his ability to continue as a candidate during that time because of his age. And so we can talk all we want about what's he doing about it today, but the fundamentals in this campaign about age overshadow everything, and they've been there ever since the day he announced. And so all he has done is play to that negative, play to the weakness. It's almost like his border policy. You know, if he was running on border policy and you have, 100,000 people come across the border any given month, that's going to undermine his message. His message has been undermined by himself on the most critical issue that he has, which is his age and his ability to function as president. And so, yes, there's a performative aspect to it today, but there's nothing he's going to do. The best day of his night could be tonight, and it's not going to assuage the opinion of those voters who have already made a determination that they're not going to support him.
It's been fascinating watching some straddle the line here, including some very prominent Democrats. Jeanne, we heard from Nancy Pelosi yesterday, a shot across the bow. She did not call on him to drop out. She said she was looking forward to him making his decision, even though he thought he already had. And we heard from Hakeem Jeffries today, the House Minority Leader, had this to say about the prospect of Democrats winning the House this November.
House Democrats will win back control of the House of Representatives on November 5th and vacate the extreme MAGA Republican majority as long as we are able to clearly communicate our agenda.
When asked if Joe Biden should drop out, Jeanne, he said that as long as these conversations are ongoing with his rank and file, he's going to respect the sanctity of those conversations. Will it be possible to straddle the line by tomorrow?
I think it's really tough. I mean, we've seen so many of these top Democratic leaders do this. And the reality is when Hakeem Jeffries looks at his own caucus, he already has at least 10 members who have said Joe Biden should step aside. And many of those who have expressed public concern are in competitive races, like Ryan in New York, his very own state. A state, by the way, which many people are reporting, New York and New Jersey today in private polls are within Donald Trump's grasp. I mean, just think about that. If New York and New Jersey go Trump or are that dangerously close at this point, the Democrats have already lost the White House. And the question is, can they keep the House and the Senate? The Senate really, really tough. The House a little bit more within their grasp. And so that's why you've got so many Democrats very concerned, because what happens at the top of this ticket does matter to the fate of the House and the Senate. You even have a freshman in Washington who is saying Congress is going to be the only bulwark against a Donald Trump presidency, which she describes as sure at this point. And so it's all this focus on Joe Biden that takes our eye away from the reality that Donald Trump is wildly unpopular, is in 9 years not hit 50%, is talking today about meeting with Viktor Orban. The list goes on, but we're not talking about it because Joe Biden's age is taking up all the oxygen in the room.
Well, Jeanne, we'll add another voice to this conversation. Neuberger Berman Group Steve Eisman weighed in with his thoughts on the 2024 election earlier today on Bloomberg.
100% certainty Donald Trump wins.
Interesting.
Really? 100% certainty.
Is that investable, though? What do you do?
Well, let's talk about why.
Yes.
So forget about, whether Biden's going to run. It doesn't matter at this point to me whether Biden drops out or does not drop out.
Coming up, we'll explore his prediction with our panel, Rick and Jeanne, coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to a special second hour of Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden set to hold a high-profile news conference at the NATO summit roughly 30 minutes from now, and a crucial test for his re-election campaign.
The focus is on the president's mental acuity, 2 weeks after a poor debate performance that lost him ground in polling and spurred more than a dozen Democratic lawmakers to publicly call for him to exit the race.
Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi this week called for her party to hold off on judgment until after NATO wraps this evening. Well, here we are, and here's what some of the other members of Congress have been saying this week.
I look forward to seeing him make the case about why he feels that he continues to be the best standard bearer for the party.
I can't tell people to unsee what they saw in the debate. It's not news that he is the age that he is.
The delegates will make the best possible decision if Biden provides more tests and more information.
I think they've got a good plan going forward. He's our nominee. He's our president. He's going to win.
We're about 4 weeks away from the Democratic convention. Now it's time for us to shift opinion, not simply follow what the opinion polls are saying.
I stand by my comments.
What is abundantly clear this evening as we await this press conference from President Biden is there is not much consensus at all within the Democratic Party at the moment, Joe.
With reporting that some Democratic lawmakers have already written statements calling on the president to drop out of the race, but out of respect are waiting until tomorrow when the NATO summit has concluded. Kaylee, we're going to be hearing and seeing from the president just a half an hour from now. Whether he runs late or not, we'll find out. But we just saw him a short time ago when he flubbed President Zelensky's name and called him President Putin. He did quickly correct himself when that took place, but these are the kind of moments that the White House and the campaign have been afraid of.
Absolutely, and I believe we can all relive that moment right now. This happened just moments ago at the NATO summit.
Now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
So let's bring in now Bloomberg's Jordan, Fabian, and Saleha Mohsin, who are here around the table with us. Jordan, obviously, you covered this White House. Is tonight all about making sure another moment like that does not happen?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the biggest test for Biden since the debate. But, I mean, this might not be enough. Even a good performance tonight might not be enough, just given the body blows he suffered today. You just played that devastating footage, from the event on Ukraine. There were two reports in the New York Times that indicated his campaign is testing polling on Vice President Kamala Harris, who might be his replacement if he's replaced on the ballot, and that aides outside his inner circle are increasingly of the belief that he cannot beat Donald Trump and that there needs to be a reckoning with Joe Biden about stepping down as Democratic Party nominee. And you also had a cavalcade of Democratic lawmakers come out and say Biden needs to step aside, ignoring the advice of Nancy Pelosi to let the NATO summit play out. So this is all not stacking up in Joe Biden's direction. The question is he going to come off his insistence that he is staying in?
Mm-hmm. It seems he's got MSNBC on one shoulder and the New York Times on the other right now. And I think we all know which one he prefers at the moment. Putin, that's something, frankly, we all could have done. Mm-hmm. But we're not the president. We're not running for re-election. How damaging was this moment we just saw? Or are we just way over our skis on all this, parsing every word?
We should be parsing every word. And he knows, and his aides know, this campaign and the White House know, every word is being parsed for a reason. If he was a young man, there would be no questions right now about his mental acuity, in theory, as long as it's a healthy young man, right? Mm-hmm. But he is in his 80s, and he wants to be president until he's 86, with the nuclear codes, with national security calls in the middle of the night. He needs to make key decisions. And making these kinds of mistakes when he knows everyone is watching, what kind of mistakes could he be making when there is no public transparency and accountability?
Well, you talk about parsing every word, and it's not just the words of President Biden we've been parsing, but of other high-profile Democrats, like Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, who, as we know earlier this week, when talking on MSNBC, didn't full-throatedly endorse President Biden, instead suggesting it's just his decision that he has to make soon whether or not he's running. The thing is, Saleha, he already says he's made his decision. He's staying in the race. If someone like Nancy Pelosi is suggesting otherwise, is that actually what's most telling of all?
Absolutely. Speaking of parsing words, Nancy Pelosi is known for speaking very, very carefully and intentionally. She did not issue a full-throated endorsement of another Biden run. Mm-hmm. She could have. There's no shyness there from someone like her. She didn't. She instead said, hey, he needs to make his decision. And in that interview that she did on MSNBC, someone pointed out he's made his decision. He sent a letter on Monday morning, 2 pages to congressional Democrats saying he's made his decision. So she is kind of rolling it back, saying maybe your decision isn't made. That is really, really revealing.
We're not too used to seeing this president doing primetime news conferences, East Room, that so many other presidents considered normal. He's held the fewest number since Ronald Reagan. As we've been recently reminded, Jordan, give us the specifics on this. He is in a convention center a couple of blocks from where we're sitting, and it'll be no holds barred. How many reporters? Do we have a sense of questions, format, or length?
Well, Joe, if it's any like his past White House press conferences, it's going to be kind of a tightly controlled affair. Mm-hmm. They have a list of reporters. They will
he'll still have a
down.
list tonight.
I believe so. I mean, I haven't heard otherwise. So I believe there'll be a list of people that, the White House believes should be called on. He'll run through that list. The White House envisions it going 30 minutes. Well, we only saw this really get out of control, per se, one time, and that was after the 2022 midterms when he had that 90-minute marathon press conference.
That was wild.
And it was wild, and it was a scarring experience for a lot of people in that White House who have been determined to never let that happen again.
Wow.
And so that's why you've seen a lot of the 4 questions and out type of format. Mm-hmm. The problem is he's facing calls from Democrats to do more unscripted stuff. Get out there, tell us what's on your mind, make the case that you have the mental facilities to be the president. And so if he does this kind of tightly controlled thing, 4, 5, 6 questions in and out, is that really going to satisfy those concerns, or are we just checking a box here?
Yeah.
Well, we were speaking with Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman of California earlier this week, who suggested to Joe and I that he would like to see President Biden doing 90-minute, 9 p.m. news conferences with frequency, and that is what he ultimately thinks would prove.
I'm sure the communications and press officers would love that.
He's up to the job. But it's a question of who he has to prove things to, Saleha. On the one hand, yes, it's the voters that ultimately matter. Biden has been talking a lot about party elites who are trying to push him out, including those who are providing the funds for his campaign to continue. If the donors start to turn in a more material way, if even grassroots donations start to grow up, is the money dry up, rather? Is the money what ultimately will matter the most?
So far, we've seen Bloomberg reporting has pointed to the opposite, that the money is not actually shifting Biden's thinking. The kind of stubbornness that a person needs to run for office again and again, as he has for half of his life, maybe more than half of his life, it is the same stubbornness that is keeping him in office. It's going to come down to the people that are closest to him to not veil the truth and to show him a mirror and show what he's really doing.
So you wonder if it's the cash or the path. We know that there was a closed-door conversation with union leaders, Sean Fain among them, very critical of the campaign without being able to show a provable path, a realistic path to victory here. And a memo went out from the campaign today that did not convince donors that they have one, Jordan.
That's right. There's been a lot of magical thinking with the Biden campaign. They've really tried to treat this as a run-of-the-mill political controversy, and they've issued this messaging that's really short on numbers, but is insisting that he still has a path to victory through the blue wall states, that this is not a seismic event in the campaign, that the race is still within a margin of error. Now, yes, we've seen a couple of public polls that have shown that, but most of public polls have shown Donald Trump expanding his lead. And you need to show, fellow Democrats, if you're the Biden campaign, there's a way to recover that margin. And guess what? This is not a sex scandal. This is not a financial improprieties. This is age. It only goes in one direction. And so there's really no convincing anybody that Joe Biden's performance is really going to get better over the next few years.
Well, and on the idea of sex scandals and financial impropriety, it's worth noting we just got the news that Donald Trump has officially asked the judge in his New York hush money case, in which he was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, to throw that out because of the Supreme Court ruling. on immunity from last month. It strikes me that today, July 11th, we're talking about Biden's press conference. This was supposed to be the day in which Donald Trump got sentenced in that case. We haven't touched it at all, which begs the question, Jordan, how badly does Donald Trump need Joe Biden to stay in this race? Does he want to be running against anyone else?
Oh, very badly. They've tailored their entire strategy around Joe Biden and focusing on his age and fitness for office. Take a look at any Republican social media feed. It's just full of clips of Joe Biden doing the type of thing they did today at that meeting on Ukraine. And they're going to need to dramatically shift their messaging if anyone's put back in there. Kamala Harris, are starting to focus on her as someone who might be a replacement for Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. Their messaging, I mean, frankly, has been kind of racist. Like they're calling her a DEI hire. Is that going to go over well with the public? I mean, they
intentionally mispronouncing her name.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have a lot of racial problems in this country. Maybe it will resonate with some people, sure, but that's not necessarily the type of messaging that's going to win over those undecided voters who might not think that way and are going to be put off by that kind of blunt messaging from Donald Trump. And so they have a lot of thinking to do if it's someone other than Joe Biden.
Really smart analysis from Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian and Saleha Mohsin. Thank you so much for being here as we stand by for the news conference. And joining us now is Charlie Cook, the founder and contributor of the Cook Political Report, who we like to call on important days like these. Charlie, our questions are simple tonight. Does this matter for the future of Joe Biden's political career? He's got a job to do as president, but a lot of people think we're beyond the point of a course correction here.
Yeah, I think the president's lost control of events here. And, it's not really a question of whether, it's sort of when and how. And I think it's going to be pretty soon. It's just starting to tumble out of control. And I don't think there's any stopping it for the White House right now.
Well, that's pretty remarkable to hear you say, Charlie, because to this point, President Biden has remained quite stubborn in his assertion that he is staying in this race and still believes that he can beat Donald Trump. Are you essentially saying that there is no way at this time that he has a credible path to doing so?
I try to be very, very cautious. You know that. And I can't find any reason to be cautious here because you can't run a campaign without money. And I think theirs is drying up. You have to have support of party leaders. That's drying up. I think, we're overtaken with events here. And it's really out of his control. I think it is unfortunate that, the NATO leaders are not, in the air yet and fully. And, this is happening now. If they had been a little bit more proactive, they probably could have bought a little bit of time. But I think it's too late now, really.
Well, Charlie, I can't believe what I'm hearing from you. Your caution and your credibility is the reason why we call you. And so Joe Biden's an hour away from this. What are you going to be looking for tonight? Does it matter what he says? I think your answer is no, but he's also got a legacy to protect. There are questions about the direction of fundraising. And to your point, I don't mean to keep adding on questions here, but once these leaders get in the air, it's going to feel different. What are we talking about tomorrow morning?
The thing is, I think the president's like he's on a high wire. And does he make a misstep tonight? Does he make a misstep Monday with Lester Holt? I mean, that there's going to be a misstep at some point, and so that even if he tries to drag it out, it's only a matter of time before anybody would make a misstep and off they go. The thing is, these Democratic leaders, they like him, they appreciate him, they agree with most of everything he's done. They don't like the idea. Each one has been sort of waiting on somebody else to come out against him because they didn't want to do it themselves and waited around. And that's probably what extended it, is there was a reticence among Democratic leaders to publicly come out and say, okay, time's up, because none of them really wanted to do this, and they don't want to hurt him because they really do like him. And but I think it's just a matter of days or hours or something.
Well, if the clock really is ticking, it becomes a question not just of the presidential race, Charlie, but what the effect will be in terms of the composition of Congress and the balance of it. We heard from the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, just today, who said Biden isn't a liability. Democrats will take back the House. Do you think they can do so or keep hold of the Senate, for that matter, with Biden on top of the ticket? Or is that actually what this is going to be about? Not just if Biden loses, but he makes others lose in extension.
I think Jeffries can't really say anything else. But clearly, it's roughly 50-50 whether Democrats could pick the House back up if there was no president top of the ticket discount or a disadvantage here. They've got no margin at all. That they can't afford anything above them to be dragging them down. And so it's just, the Senate is probably gone for Democrats anyway, but how deep is the hole going to be? Do they lose 2 seats, 3 seats, 4 seats? And how much longer would it take them to get back out of that hole? And the same thing in the House. So nobody up there is having a good time. They're not enjoying offing their leader, but it's now become a matter of sort of preservation. And, whether it goes to the vice president or whether it opens up and goes to a, Carville-like scenario at the convention, I don't know. I think the odds are probably pretty high that it ends up being Harris. And while that's not necessarily the optimal solution, it may be the best that Democrats can have at this point. But it's possible it gets opened up, but I think the odds are probably against that.
How much time does Joe Biden have here? We're going to go to Milwaukee next week. Charlie, maybe you'll be there. And I suspect we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about vice presidential announcement, Donald Trump, and many of the ideas that surround his campaign. When we get back to reality after the convention, you said maybe hours or days. Does this conversation need to end?
Yeah, I'd probably put a $5 down on over the weekend, to be honest. I don't know that it'll get, deep into Monday if it gets to midday Monday. But there's just going to be a lot of pressure just to go ahead and do it. But, obviously, I think, clearly some of the closest people to him have started throwing in the towel themselves, and they'd be the dead last to do it, short of the president himself and his family. But, I think he's going to find himself, or he's finding himself very isolated, and, he'll figure it out. It's against every fiber of his body, but, I think in the end he will do what he needs to do, and that end won't be too far off.
Okay, so if we think about the potential sequence of events you're lining out here, if Joe Biden were indeed to decide on the eve of the Republican convention that he is leaving the race, how does that then change the nature of what the Republicans are about to do in Milwaukee next week? If you're Donald Trump, does that make you think differently about who you want to pick to be vice president? I mean, certainly some kind of strategy shift would need to happen.
Yeah, I don't know how much it would affect Trump's decision, but it sure would step over the news at the Republican convention. I don't know how you get a message across if you've got a president stepping away from a campaign and all the focus going on, okay, what are Democrats going to do next? So it'll be a little hard for Republicans to get their message through that week. But, my guess is that former President Trump has already made up his mind, but just hasn't tipped his hand yet. But it's getting a little late to make up his mind, and I think everybody's expecting something, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, to get word of who he's going to pick. So this is all going to be having a really tight time frame.
Will Joe Biden's departure be hastened by a critical mass of congressional Democrats calling him to drop out tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that a lot of members have been listening to Pelosi and say, please, let's get this NATO thing going. But, can you just hold off? Can you just hold off a little bit and let everybody get out of town? then that would be better off. And I think that's ultimately what will end up happening. But, you know, that picture, the graphic you've got up, that's just going to get bigger and bigger. And, you know, it's now to the point where it's pretty much, you know, I don't think this is survivable, to be honest.
Yeah, for those listening on radio, what you were seeing was the faces of more than a dozen Democratic lawmakers who have now called for President Biden to drop out publicly. Charlie Cook, founder and contributor of the Cook Political Report. Great to have you this evening. We appreciate your insight. No, we appreciate everyone joining us on Bloomberg Television and Radio, and your appearance with us, Charlie, is hugely important to us, and we appreciate it. Days or hours is what he told us.
I can't believe what we just heard.
Unbelievable. Of course, we expect we have less than an hour to go until President Biden's press conference. We'll have more ahead with our political panel on expectations for this evening. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington in overtime tonight on Balance of Power as we await a news conference from President Joe Biden. He's a couple blocks away from us at the NATO summit here in downtown Washington, a news conference scheduled for 6:30. That appears to be running a bit late, but when it does begin, we'll be bringing it to you in full with so many questions about his mental acuity, his ability to serve another term as president. And back with us now in hour two is our political panel. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's great to have you both here. As we count down to something, Rick, we're not sure exactly when this is going to start, but you've been through enough of these to have a sense of the mechanics. Jordan Fabian was talking with us earlier. He's going to have a list of reporters. What does Joe Biden need to accomplish if he's going to make an impression here, and how quickly does he need to do it?
You know, it's interesting because normally in advance of a big press conference like this where you're the star of the show, you would be huddled with your team for the better part of the afternoon working on different approaches to different issues. What are we going to say? How do you talk about it? Here's a reporter. They're really thinking about a certain policy or project. I guess all of them are, when are you going to get out, or questions.
Is that all we get tonight?
But I think that that hasn't happened because he's been in the middle of this NATO summit. So, you know, I'm sure they're sitting down right now, you know, as he said goodbye to the rest of the leaders and trying to do a cram course in how to survive a press conference. Jeez. And as we've seen many times sitting here thinking, oh, this is just going to be a quickie, you know, an hour later, they're like putting a hook on him and trying to drag him off the stage. I would not be surprised to see something like that happen tonight.
Marathon.
Joe Biden thinks in his own head that he's got to do something special. And when he thinks that usually means stand up there and answer questions until there are no more questions.
Oh, man.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the prep for this, Rick, because we've been talking about this internally at our meetings today, the idea that he spent days at Camp David, huddled with close advisors, doing rigorous preparations for the debate 2 weeks ago that set this whole thing off with calls for him to drop out of the race. Jeanne, knowing how that debate ultimately went down, is Joe Biden going to want to do the exact opposite this evening, as little prep as possible?
Yeah, and hope it gets better. You know, he does need prep. I mean, we've been told he not only needs prep, but he needs rest. And he has had quite a week with this NATO summit so far. So he can't have gotten as much rest as he possibly needs. And to Rick's point, he doesn't have a lot of prep time, at least today. And, you know, I just can't help but think for a moment, what an extraordinary situation this is. We have a sitting president, the incumbent or presumptive nominee of his party, who many Democrats are now publicly calling to withdraw from the race. And this story has galvanized the press. The debate was, what, a week and a half ago? And he's holding a press conference now? A lot of Democrats were saying the minute that debate was over, he should have gotten out and he should have been talking to the public repeatedly. And he hasn't done that. And that has made the stakes of what's going to happen tonight all that much more important and intense, although I'm not sure there's anything he can do, even cartwheels for gosh sake at this point, which is going to convince the American people that he is up to this task for 4 more years.
I'm sticking with one-arm push-ups today, Jeanne, but I am curious about duration. Jordan Fabian tells us the White House is planning for about 30 minutes. Rick reminds us of the hour-and-a-half-long slog that followed the midterms, and there were reports that the press office did not want to ever relive that experience. What's nourishing for this press corps that in many cases feels betrayed by this White House?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to try to keep him there as long as they can. I'm sure his staff is trying to get him off the stage, but he is not one to want to get off the stage, especially now when he feels like he has so much to prove. So I think this could go longer, although, you know, if he listens to what his staff is saying, he will try to get in and out with as little damage as possible. In particular, I am listening to see, does he get angry? Does he have a temper flare? We've seen him have that. It's not just the gaffes. It's not just the sort of, you know, losing track of what he's saying. It's his temper, and that can get the better of him. And to your point, Rick, Joe, sorry, to your point, the press corps is very, very frustrated with the lack of information and access they've gotten to this president so far.
Well, we'll see how much time the press corps gets to ask him questions this evening. But on the subject of timing, Rick, we were just speaking with Charlie Cook, who suggested that he essentially thinks Biden has hours or days, that he sees it as inevitable as Biden dropping out. Knowing, though, that we are up against the start of the Republican convention in Milwaukee next week. If you're running the campaign, how does that factor into your decision making here?
Yeah, look, you would obviously hope that you would have enough of a strategic overlay to think through exactly what you just talked about, Kayleigh. What's the best possible time to do this? Force the Republican convention to address you as the candidate. Don't give them an opening to go after whoever might follow you. In fact, use the opportunity to lob some bombs of your own into the convention. Setting up this ABC interview for Monday night of the convention breaks a lot of china when it comes to what's normal. Normally, a candidate gives the opponent the week of his convention to do what they want. They rarely campaign against you. And here is a frontal assault on Monday night where the President of the United States is going to go on national television with Lester Holt and try to take the attention away from Donald Trump's convention. So you really kind of hope they think that through, because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, even if it's going to happen this weekend, even if the decision is already made, to tip your hat to the Republicans in advance of their convention. Take one for the team, right? Let them attack you all week long and then not be the one that matters. So I think those are the kinds of things that unfortunately, if you're in a state of denial right now, and the White House does seem, and the campaign does seem in a state of denial, where they're pushing back on every source that they can that seems to be popping up. It's like whack-a-mole in the White House right now. Then you're not addressing those issues. You're not planning for the future. You're not thinking about how to roll out a new campaign. And that's when it gets really messy and ugly and inefficient.
That interview with Lester Holt set to air on NBC on Monday. I guess we'll see what the actual topic of conversation is, whether we're staying in or dropping out. Would that just be an enormous disservice to a Kamala Harris candidacy if Joe Biden drops the next couple of days, allowing Donald Trump to pick away at the new opponent for the better part of the week at the actual convention in Milwaukee?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would make the most sense if he has made the decision to drop, not to do it this weekend or before the convention, but to do it after. You know, we have the Olympics coming up. People are on the summer vacation. It is a challenge for the Democrats, because if he does drop, what happens next is going to be, you know, anybody's guess at this point how they could handle this. But I don't think it would be quite fair to Kamala Harris to do it at this point. And if there's one thing we know about Joe Biden, he is a patriot, and he does in many ways want to do what is best for the Democratic Party. So I think if he makes this decision before, it would make sense to wait. And of course, you know, the reality is that the odd thing about this is nobody wants Joe Biden to stay in this race more than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has made that very clear. He does not want to go against Kamala Harris or any other Democrat.
Well, it is now 6:32 p.m. Eastern time. So clearly, Joe Biden is running a bit behind schedule. The press conference has not yet begun, though we do expect it will happen in some time, which is why we're bringing you this special extended edition of Balance of Power this evening on Bloomberg TV and radio. And Jeanne, usually at this time here at Bloomberg, we're waiting for Asian markets to open up. Our global audience is likely tuning in right now. And I wonder if you're sitting outside the U.S. and you're considering what's about to go down, knowing that you just said it's anyone's guess what would happen within the Democratic Party if indeed Joe Biden steps out. How chaotic could this get when to this point we've all been expecting kind of status quo, just 2020 rematch? We've all seen this dance before.
Yeah, and I've just gotten back from Europe and Scandinavia, and the number of people who asked me, what is going on? I mean, particularly after the debate that we all watched. And you're hard pressed to explain it. But they, too, look over here. Now, granted, there's chaos in other parts of the world, but they look over here and they say, what is happening in the United States? And, of course, in this case, if Joe Biden does drop out, there is no real structure. You know, we are hearing a lot of talk in the Democratic Party about things like mini town halls, mini primaries. There is no sort of, process by which this would unfold if he does drop out, because we have never been here before. So for people in the United States, certainly, but around the world, what happens next is really anybody's game. And of course, it takes away all the focus from other things that we could be talking about, the inflation numbers today, the NATO meeting, what happened in France with their election the other day, the UK. I mean, the list goes on, and all the focus is now on Joe Biden's age, and if he drops, who steps up to the plate, and how do we get that person in position?
Rick Davis, in 2008, we were all headed to the Twin Cities for your convention for John McCain. You had to deal with a hurricane that interfered with, or at least challenged, the start of your convention. To flip the question from what Kayleigh was asking you before, if you're planning this one, Joe Biden drops out of the race 24 hours before you start, how does that change the agenda or the strategy for Milwaukee?
Well, it turns it into a rally, because there could be no more exciting thing than to actually beat Joe Biden in advance of the election. So that's the best thing that could happen. It's certainly a good thing for the excitement and attention to the delegates in the convention hall. I mean, think about it. It's a scalp that Donald Trump will effectively hold up when he gives his speech accepting the nomination on Thursday night next week, and say, 1 week from today, I did what I said I was going to do, and I didn't even have to win an election to do it. It's quite an image. It's quite an image. So the reality is there's really no scenario right now that doesn't play to the Trump campaign. Even a fresh candidate still has to raise money, put a team together, figure out what the messages are, be introduced to the American public. And you're doing it during the summer when it's very hard to do. I mean, you're basically saying between the Republican convention and the Democratic convention, nothing positive is going to happen, right? I mean, that's just kind of a vacuum. And so really the Democrats have this challenge that if Joe Biden does decide to withdraw, their convention is going to be the moment in time when 80 million Americans will look in and say, what the heck is going on, and who's the candidate going to be? Because prior to that, people are at the beach, they're playing golf, they're doing things. This is happening in a vacuum, and it's not going to be the attention of the voters until it's settled. And that is who comes out of that convention the nominee.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are going to be sticking with us throughout this hour as we await President Biden's press conference set to begin any minute now. Now, still ahead, we'll add another voice to this conversation. Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina will join us with his thoughts as we await this crucial moment for President Biden, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, a special extended edition as we await a crucial moment for President Joe Biden and his reelection campaign. Any minute now, we are expecting him to partake in a press conference at the NATO summit here in Washington, coming at a critical moment, exactly 2 weeks to the day since his poor debate performance against Donald Trump that has precipitated a shift in polling and a shift, it seems, within the Democratic Party. As Joe, in the hours leading up to this press conference tonight, we have seen even more Democratic lawmakers come out and say that Joe Biden should exit this race. There are now 13 members of the House and one Democratic senator who have called for him to exit.
Yeah, Senator Peter Welch, the Democrat from Vermont, remains the only from the upper chamber, and we're wondering if that might change in the wake of this news conference, as many lawmakers were reportedly waiting for world leaders to leave and be polite to Joe Biden here. But, you know, look, we're talking 13 out of 213, and we'll see where we are by tomorrow. Each one of these, though, is another brick in the wall here, another part of the mosaic that is hanging over Joe Biden tonight.
Absolutely. And it's worth reminding our listeners and viewers that we heard from House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi in a television interview on MSNBC earlier this week, suggesting that members of her party should hold off on their judgments at least until NATO is over. Well, it's ending tonight. So the question is, what's going to happen tomorrow morning? Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina. Sir, it's great to have you back. The last time we spoke with you, in fact, was on debate night. We have seen now a number of your colleagues suggest that they do not believe Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump in November. They think he should drop out for that reason. Do you have any chance of changing your mind that you believe Biden can beat Trump depending on his performance tonight, or are you with him all the way no matter what?
Well, right now, Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, and my focus is just doing everything that we can do and have to do to beat Donald Trump and make sure he never sets foot in the Oval Office. And of the candidates we have right now, Joe Biden is the one with a history of working across the aisle in a bipartisan way. I think that's incredibly important. You know, the voting rights are on the ballot in this election. Women's reproductive health rights are on the ballot in a way that's incredibly important. And we need to focus on those issues. But there are certainly members of the House Democratic Caucus who feel differently right now. But as is the case every single day, it's up to Joe Biden to prove that he's up to the job. And like you, I'm going to be watching this press conference as well.
Well, it gives us a sense that things could still move following this event. Congressman, I know that you're an ally of Joe Biden's. I also know that you've been a gentleman anytime we have ever interacted here on or off the air. Do you really believe that Joe Biden is the only person who can beat Donald Trump?
I think there are a ton of people who could beat Donald Trump because he is such a historically unpopular figure in American politics. The worst president we've ever had. He's someone who wants to ban abortion with no exceptions. He's focused on tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy at the expense of the middle-class working families that I represent in Congress. Those are not...
Okay, do you believe Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump?
Absolutely, you know, because he has done it before. And I think what's important to point out is states like North Carolina are going to be so crucial and critical. And we won a seat in my congressional district as a Republican. It was a Republican seat that we won, one of just 6 that we flipped in the last election because we campaigned against MAGA extremism. We campaigned for women's reproductive health rights. Those are the issues that are going to motivate voters in swing states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Michigan. We ought to be looking at those folks to see what they think. And by all accounts, you know, that's the place where this battle for the presidency is going to be waged. And we have a compelling message right now with the accomplishments of the Biden administration. I want to hear him talk more about what he wants to do in the future. I think that's especially important for this upcoming press conference. And you know, if he stays true to those messages, those talking points, I think we're going to see you know, a different set of focus from my other colleagues in Congress.
But Congressman, it's a question of to what extent that policy and discussions about the platform can actually break through in a moment in which everyone is just focused on his performance and whether or not he misspeaks or has some kind of gaffe. Is it not doing the Democratic Party as a whole a disservice that the questions around the policy you would like to pursue are almost irrelevant at a time where everyone's just focused on an 81-year-old president?
I absolutely. I wish we were talking about Donald Trump and his dismal record. I wish we were talking about the good things that President Biden has done. But until Joe Biden puts this issue to rest, day in and day out by coming and campaigning aggressively all over the country, having one-on-one press interviews where people get to see him in action, having town halls. I've invited him to come to North Carolina's 13th district to have a town hall meeting with Democrats, Republicans, and independents so they can see him in action. That's what he needs to do to turn the page here. And I'm very hopeful that he can. I'm rooting for him. And, that's where I fall right now among House Democrats.
Interesting to hear from Hakeem Jeffries earlier today. Your Democratic leader in the House answered questions from reporters about these conversations that we're sharing together right now. Congressman, here's what he said.
House Democrats are engaged in conversations with House Democrats at this moment in time. Those conversations have been candid, clear-eyed, and comprehensive. And that's important for us to do as a House Democratic Caucus family. And as long as those conversations are ongoing, I'm going to respect the sanctity of those conversations until we conclude that process.
These are some serious eggshells we're walking on here, Congressman. Will that still be the case tomorrow morning? Does this actually depend on how the president performs tonight?
I think always with House Democrats, we are a separate branch of government. We are focused on making sure that Hakeem Jeffries is the next Speaker of the House. So you're going to continue to have folks who have very different views on what's the best way to get there. But we all agree that our only goal is making sure Hakeem Jeffries is our Speaker and making sure Donald Trump never sets foot in the Oval Office. We continue to make data-driven decisions about every piece of that puzzle. And this press conference we're going to see certainly is one of those pieces. My focus, though, is just making the case for why we need to get out to vote in this election and make sure Donald Trump never gets anywhere near the Oval Office.
Sir, as we listen to what Hakeem Jeffries is saying, what we heard from Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi this week kind of calls for the party to hold off. That's certainly not what we're seeing, as we see a trickle of your colleagues deciding to come out and speak their mind about the notion that Joe Biden should indeed leave the race. For all of the talk we have had in this Congress specifically about the division within the Republican Party, is this exacerbating divisions within your party? And if so, how do they recover from this?
I don't think we're divided in our goals. Our goals are to make sure, we get Hakeem Jeffries as the Speaker of the House and we make sure that Donald Trump never becomes president. And a lot of different ideas about the best way to get there. But, the folks who've come out and spoken, they're made their feelings known about what they think Joe Biden should do, are within their rights to do it. We support, a diverse group of folks with very different opinions on the best way to move forward. But we all agree that we're here to support each other. We're here to make sure we get more Democrats elected. And I think that's the messy process you're seeing play out.
All right, Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina, thank you so much for joining us, sir. Hopefully we can have you back soon and talk a bit more about policy. Coming up, we await President Biden's news conference as we have questions about how much policy will really break through as all eyes are on his performance and mental acuity. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel, will be back with us next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in overtime now as we wait for Joe Biden to emerge and hold a news conference at the NATO summit here in Washington. He's about 20 minutes late so far, and we will bring you his words when he begins live here on Bloomberg. Back with us, our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are here as we stand by for the president, having heard more Democratic lawmakers join the call today for him to drop out of this presidential race. Rick, it's 13 out of 213. Where does that number end up tomorrow, do we think?
I can imagine that the conventional wisdom is that people are being deferential to the president while he entertains
Does that ring true?
heads of state. Yeah, that rings true. I mean, these are people who really like Joe Biden, right? They've had their careers tied to his for almost all of their career because he spanned such a long period of time. And I don't see a lot of anger out there about it. It's more deference to their own saving of their own skin, right? I mean, like, what's happened is it was one thing to say, you know, Joe Biden did poorly, and that might make the race with Trump more competitive. But what's happened in the week since the debate is I think these people are all pulling their own districts, and they're saying, oh, my God, my numbers are now being affected. Because we've talked about this a lot in our Bloomberg coverage, but, like, politics is national now. It's not local. See, in the old days, they would have driven their outcome. But the presidential ticket now drives the outcome of congressional races. There are very few examples where local, state, and local politicians are able to overcome the immense weight of the national ticket. If you are a red state, you are going to have red state representatives. If you're a blue state, you're going to have blue state representatives. And the ones we've heard from are the ones who are blue representatives in red states or red districts. And so I don't blame them. They're panicking. And they have to take care of their own election before they can think about Joe Biden.
Well, so it raises the question, Jeanne, when we think back to the ABC interview that Biden did last week, when he was asked by George Stephanopoulos how he would feel come January if he had lost the election and Donald Trump became president again. And he essentially said as long as he had given it his all, he would be okay with that outcome. What about if that comes at the detriment to the balance of Congress, to the notion that you could potentially not see a Democratic Senate anymore or the House flip Democratic either, Jeanne? Is that really what is at stake here, not just the presidential outcome?
It is. And, you know, that statement was one that really upset a lot of Democrats. And I know Rick is saying that he doesn't see a lot of anger out there amongst Democrats at Joe Biden. I think that is true. People do understand he is, you know, in his state, he is elderly and they understand his service. But there is some anger out there at the idea he is saying that, you know, if I do my best, that's all that matters. But to Democrats, that's not all that matters. They are particularly frightened about the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency. This week alone, Democrats wanted to talk about Project 2025 and what that means for the future of themselves and their children. They haven't been able to do that, like so many things, as Joe Biden's age has, you know, just occupied all the oxygen in the room. So, you know, that statement was particularly frustrating to Democrats, as was the statement that he made to George Stephanopoulos that day about, you know, he would step out if God Almighty told him to. He is not the king. He is a Democratic serving president. And these people are elected, and 3/4 of his own party or more say he is too old to serve, and they've been saying it for a long time. So those kinds of statements have not served him well.
Just want to come back around to this down ballot idea, Rick. Considering the impact of national politics, as you suggest, the NRCC is trying to make this national issue a local one to the detriment of Democrats, 10 House Democrats in swing districts. They've got a new digital ad campaign that accuses them of, quote, witnessing Biden's mental failures up close and engaging in a cover-up. They'll call it the scandal of the century in these ads. Will that work?
Yeah, I think that the American public, this is all they're hearing about, right? I mean, it's the only issue, right? Even today, we're talking about the last comments by Joe Biden at the NATO summit, and he calls Zelensky Putin, and it's like plays right into that ad. So everyone has got this burden, right? If you're a Democrat, you're carrying around the Biden burden. And so absolutely it's going to be the interest of the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee to go right at that, because it plays into the narrative. And they know what we know, which is it's very hard to cut through summer, you know, and the lack of interest by voters. So they want to play into whatever that headline is. And that headline is Biden's age, Biden's infirmity. It makes total sense that they would package that. And that will be, regardless of what happens to Joe Biden, a consistent theme in congressional campaign commercials throughout these, you know, frontline districts.
Jeanne, Jeanne, we keep having conversations about how ultimately this decision is going to come down to Joe Biden, how potentially that decision, even though he says he already has made it to stay in this race, could be affected by his performance in this press conference we're expecting any minute now. It also begs the question that this is now a conversation we're having for real in July, when theoretically Joe Biden could have made the decision well before this not to run, to put forward someone else, someone younger within the Democratic Party. There could have been voices around him that would have encouraged him to do so. And that did not happen. When we do the post-mortem of this, whatever the outcome, if he stays in the race or not, who's to blame here?
You know, I think there's a lot of finger pointing at this point. And, you know, there have been polls for a long time suggesting that the Democratic voters, the base voters, did want options. They've been screaming for them. And somebody like Dean Phillips may end up being somebody who can say, I told you so. And, you know, the accusations are falling on elites within the party. We've heard charges of the press not doing their job, getting close enough to Joe Biden and showing the American public the state he was in. And I think that's why that ad that the Republicans are putting up is an effective ad, because people find it difficult to imagine that people who see Joe Biden closely, that they were shocked all of a sudden during this debate that he had these lapses, that this wasn't apparent beforehand. And you even look at George Clooney's editorial, he says in there, we saw it, we knew. And one of the questions to be asked of George Clooney and others is, why didn't you say anything? So there is a lot of finger pointing going on. And I do think that the Democratic Party leaders are going to have to manage that. At this point, they're saying it's up to Joe Biden. But this is a party. It is not supposed to be an anointment. And that is what rubs people wrong about that idea.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we're in extended coverage now, waiting for President Biden to hold forth in a news conference at the NATO summit here in Washington. It was scheduled to begin a half hour ago. They have brought the press pool into the room. We have yet to see the president as they put the finishing touches here on the podium and get the room ready for what has been framed as the political moment of Joe Biden's life. If you've been with us here on Bloomberg, we've been talking to some smart political minds about whether he even has a chance to recover from the debate that took place 2 weeks ago tonight. Rick, will it be incumbent upon Joe Biden? Of course, we've described this as something without the paddles, no teleprompter, but he will have some opening remarks before we go to Q&A. Does he need to address this issue off the top, or does he have to speak to NATO as his job as president?
Yeah, look, he's obviously going to talk about NATO. It's just what he's walked off the stage. And regardless of whether he addresses the age issue, it's going to be the first question, the second question, the third question. I mean, This is Shark Week in the press pool in White House, right? I mean, they have been beat up by the press secretary, led astray on issues relevant to the president's neurosurgeon coming in and talking to him. They are angry. They're ready for a fight. And they know that this is their last chance to potentially talk to Joe Biden and get their ounce of flesh for what they think has been a secretive process in the White House to deny them access and information. So I think this cannot be understated, that this is going to be all about the relationship between honesty and integrity within the White House on Joe Biden's condition. And Joe Biden's going to have to go into very much detail, because they'll demand it, on what doctors he's seeing, what are their diagnoses, will they release documents related to that? It's going to be a tough session for the president, and the press corps is ready for a fight.
All right, Rick, hold that thought. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, stick tight. We're going to be coming right back to you as we await President Biden's press conference here on Bloomberg TV and radio. First, though, we do want to get a check on Asian markets, and Bloomberg Shery has that for us from Tokyo. Hey, Shery.
Right, Kaylee. Of course, markets are keeping a close eye on what's happening in Washington around the NATO summit, around President Biden. But it's really about the Fed rate path that's really rippled across markets. We are seeing U.S. futures now coming online, pretty muted early in the Asian session. And this, of course, after we saw the S&P 500 fall, take a little bit of a hit as we're seeing this rotation out of the big mega caps, given that we're seeing more signs of U.S. cooling inflation. We're talking about those core CPI numbers coming in at the slowest pace of gains since 2021. We're seeing oil coming online in the Asian session. We continue to see those gains at 0.4%, but we had seen a report earlier signaling that perhaps crude demand from China would start to slow down. And that's the key question, right? If we have more tensions between China and the U.S. and that economic recovery in China that might not be maintained, what's that going to mean for the rest of the market? Switch up the board and you can see what the CNH offshore yuan is doing, because we saw a little bit of gains in the overnight session against the U.S. dollar because we had that weakness in the U.S. dollar overnight as we saw those yields under pressure. Right now, really not maintained in the Asian session. And this is what analysts are saying, that we could see more pressure on the Chinese yuan if we have more volatility around the U.S. elections and more perhaps pressure coming from a potential Trump presidency. Take a look at how Japanese assets are trading at the moment, because that's a whole different story. Overnight in the U.S. session, we actually had a 2% jump in the Japanese yen. There was a lot of speculation about whether authorities in Japan had intervened after the U.S. CPI numbers. We didn't get confirmation, but of course, it's all about those rate differentials and where the Fed goes from here, guys.
Bloomberg, Shery, we thank you for the update, keeping our eyes on the markets for you, of course, as we deal with politics here in the U.S. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons here on Bloomberg TV and radio with special extended coverage from Washington ahead of President Biden's news conference. The stage has been set. We have a podium in place at the convention center a couple of blocks from where we sit now, where the NATO summit has taken place these past 3 days. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, there's the setting for Joe Biden's conversation with reporters who have been brought into the room. We'll give you a bit of a wider peek here as you see the 75th anniversary logo in the center of the room, reminding us that this is a news conference about a NATO summit. But to Rick Davis's point earlier, the first, second, and likely third questions will probably be about Joe Biden's age, his mental acuity. And at this point, Kaylee, we have no sense exactly of how long this is going to go, because it's been difficult for the White House to even tell us when it's going to begin.
Yeah, we're not sure exactly the moment at which President Biden will start speaking. We'll, of course, bring you the remarks as soon as they do. But in the final stretches here, you have to imagine, Joe, that the president is giving some pretty hard thoughts as to what exactly he wants to communicate, not just to the reporters gathered in that room, but to the American people. How does he reassure them after his debate performance that was 2 weeks ago this evening?
That's right. 2 weeks have gone by, and this is the first time we're going to see the president unscripted in a back and forth with reporters here in Washington. He's held a couple of rallies. They've had teleprompters. He's held some very brief events, going to a school at one point, addressing people on a rope line, 5 or 10 minutes at most. This is going to be the longest encounter that we've seen from the president in quite some time here. As we reassemble our political panel, we have the best with us tonight, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg politics contributors from Washington to New York. Jeanne, I'll ask you the same question I asked Rick a short time ago. How quickly does Joe Biden need to get to the issue that everyone is here to talk about? And unfortunately for the alliance, it doesn't have to do with NATO. It has to do with his age and his mental acuity.
He has to address it very quickly. You know, the reality is that he is off to a pretty difficult start before this even begins tonight, because he introduced President Zelensky as Putin, and that gaffe has already been making the rounds on social media. And so it's a really bumpy, difficult start for him, which means, as we knew even before that, he's got to address this right away. And I think he's got to say, I will take those cognitive tests. I will release those to the public. I will show you that I am okay. And then he's got to show us in terms of having interactions with the press and answering what should be some really tough questions about a sense that the press has been misled about his condition, given the visits by the doctor, that they didn't feel like they got information forthcoming. And by the way, I hope that this White House or the next one promises to give reporters access to the White House logs, who is coming in and out of the White House, who is coming in and out of the president's residence and visiting. This is information we as American voters need and should be accessible.
So as we await President Biden to walk up to the podium any minute now, and we talk about how high stakes this moment is, Rick, we know that he could do this tonight, and whatever bar any individual who is watching it has set. We'll see if he is able to exceed it or not. It becomes a question of then what happens tomorrow? What happens in the interview on NBC with Lester Holt on Monday night, or the appearances that he has scheduled next week to kind of counter-program the RNC in Milwaukee? Is this potentially, could this get into a scenario where even if you take a step forward, you could take a step back just as easily? Is that an escapable cycle for President Biden?
Yeah, I think it's already baked into the numbers. I mean, when we look at public opinion polling right now around this issue, it's on a downward trajectory for him. And it's been out there since the day he announced he was going to run for re-election. So people had hesitations about his age. It's always been the underlying condition of his entire campaign. You wonder if that wasn't the problem, how people would feel about the economy, how they would feel about his work overseas with the military. So everything up until this point in time has been defined by this issue. And now this issue is number 1, 2, and 3 in the voters' mind, right? He cannot escape a conversation with the voters, whether it's, at an event, at a town hall, on TV, at a rally, at his own convention, without having to address this issue. And so tonight, I think, is a good indication of how he will react to that. If you follow sort of the Jeanne Zaino scripture, you would actually hit it right off the top of the head, right? And you would actually make a joke about calling Zelensky Putin, which is on everybody's mind because he just did it. And so, but I don't think we can expect to see that. I don't think this organization around Biden, his White House team and his political team, feel like they can open the kimono when it comes to a conversation with the American people and the press corps assembled, where we're about to hear the first question, in a way that's sort of open and honest. So voters are really smart people. They can tell when you're lying to them, and if he isn't truthful and open with them, he's going to get in trouble. When John McCain got in trouble on a Keating scandal early in his career, he assembled the press. He gave them every detail he had. And he said, I will stand here and answer your questions until you have none. And then I will respond to every single question that you have in my office. You can call me anytime. And he did. And he was able to overcome that scandal because he made himself 100% accessible to the media because he knows that they are the conduit to the American public.
Yeah.
Biden needs to do the same thing.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we did hear from and see President Biden already this evening. He spoke about a couple of hours ago at this point, not extended remarks. It was part of the Ukraine compact that was being announced. And as he was introducing President Zelensky, he did make a mistake. Let's go back to Joe Biden from earlier today.
Now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
It's a tough moment here, Jeanne. He couldn't have picked a worse name to drop in there than Putin. Is Rick right? Does the Jeanne Zaino prescription call for a joke? Does he own that before somebody asks him about it?
Yeah, I think he should own it. I don't even know if you can make a joke out of it, but he should certainly own it. And the irony here is we all know from watching Biden for so many decades, he is a person who is prone to gaffes. We all are, but as a public official, he is somebody who has done this repeatedly. But now he can't afford them. And that is the reason that as we look at tonight, or we look at his interview with Lester Holt on Monday and what he does going forward, people are just going to be watching and pointing out things that he may have gotten away with for many years before, but now, given where he is and the public's concern, he can't afford to do it. And so there is an irony here from somebody whose entire public career has made missteps and misstatements and gaffes, and now they are really coming back to haunt him. And this Putin-Zelensky one is one that I think is going to stick with people.
Well, and none of it goes unnoticed or uncirculated on social media, certainly from Republican operations. And the Trump campaign, for example, highlighting these moments in which he either has a gaffe or perhaps has a moment in which he looks confused, Rick. This is a consistent strategy we have seen. But as we consider who's watching this tonight, surely Donald Trump is going to be paying attention to this as well, as will his aides and campaign staff. Does that strategy have to shift if Joe Biden drops out? They have built their campaign around running against Joe Biden, right? How badly does Donald Trump need this to actually potentially go well for Biden?
Yeah, it's hard to say whether or not Donald Trump personally is invested in a continuing Biden campaign. There's something to be said for beating Biden well in advance of Election Day, right? As they go into their convention, they're going to make good use of that, as you say. I think there's enough confidence at this stage at the Trump campaign that they don't really care who comes against them. They'd prefer Biden stick it out, right? Because even within his own party, he's going to have trouble getting votes. And so that's the perfect storm. But I think they've seen so much damage done to the Democratic coalition, and they are making good use of it. They're going after young male blacks who used to vote, in 2020 were Biden voters who are now coming over to him. Hispanic voters in Arizona and Nevada, they're targeting them because they're getting success bringing them into the Trump coalition. So I think they already feel like they've got an elixir to dismantle the Democratic voter coalitions in the states that matter to get to 270, the electoral votes he needs to be president. So I don't think they're going to be at all hesitant to take on the next comer because, if this does result in a change, it's going to have an enormous impact on the Democratic Party's ability to raise funds, get name ID, campaign in these states, put together a team, figure out what the polling's going to be. That then leads to your media strategy. For the Republicans, that's great too, right? There's really a no-lose situation for Donald Trump right now going into his convention.
Remarkable. Jeanne, I know you're not convinced by what you're hearing from the White House or the campaign, but the Biden campaign tried again today. We had a conversation earlier about cash versus clarity here. Does the money matter more than the path? We know there was a closed-door conversation with some union leaders, including Shawn Fain from the UAW, just in the last 24 to 48 hours, in which they were deeply concerned about the campaign's inability to prove a credible path. Headline in the Washington Post today: the Biden campaign memo is more dire than it might seem. The campaign tried to answer these concerns with a memo today. Digging in, as I read by Philip Bump, it presented a remarkably bleak scenario. The fact of the matter is, because of electoral changes since 2020, it's more difficult already for Joe Biden to win election. And after tonight, there will be even more questions. What do you think about this idea of a credible path simply not existing for Joe Biden?
I think it exists, but it is narrowing. And to your point, money obviously critical for campaigns. But if you can't show a path to victory, why would people fund the campaign? So they work hand in hand. That path is always going to be critical. Cook Political Reports put 6 states in the Republican lane now as a result of what, well, not totally as a result of what has happened, but making this path of victory for the Democrats very, very tough. And can I just say, I do think that Donald Trump wants to run against Joe Biden. Look at his attack on social media on George Clooney. He can't quit Joe Biden. He wants to run against him. Why? Because even as bad as Joe Biden did in that debate, when only 7% of voters said he won the debate, only 40% said that Donald Trump won. You'd expect 90+% would have said he won, but it's at 40 because Donald Trump is not a popular president. He's not a popular nominee for that party. He is beatable by Democrats. He may not be beatable by Joe Biden at this point, but he is definitely beatable. He is a person in public life for a decade who hasn't broke 50%. So his path is problematic as well. So he wants Joe Biden because he believes he can beat him this time.
Well, and Donald Trump still has a big choice to make. Maybe he's made it already, and maybe whether or not Joe Biden stays in the race through this weekend could change the outcome, Rick. But we don't know who his vice president is going to be yet or who's going to join him on the ticket. Do you think the thinking around that changes at all if the expectation is it's not going to be Biden, but potentially a Kamala Harris? Do you then need it to be a woman or a person of color? Do you have to counter that in some way?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this point, Kayleigh, because under any other circumstances, we'd be on VP watch 24/7 right now, right?
Yeah.
This has to be announced by Monday or Tuesday, right? On Monday, there's going to be a roll call where the vice president's name is put into nomination, right?
Yeah.
We are 4 days away from having to actually put that to a vote. So it normally would be the only thing that we'd be talking about right now. And yeah, I think that part of this kind of scrambles the deck for the Trump people, because every poll they've taken is their candidates they're considering against Biden-Harris. And so they only have data on that. They would then be going in blind to pick a candidate who they have no idea how that matches up to a Harris candidacy, if it's her or anybody else. And so, sure, I think that this could scramble the deck for them. I think it's one of the reasons why they are been very disciplined about not, looking like they're moving in any one direction. And I also have seen evidence that now there's many campaigns sprouting up within the Republican ranks going after the various, quote, front runners for the vice president, because everybody has their own candidate that they'd like to see on that ticket. And so it could be a very messy weekend for the Trump campaign as they sort through the VP strategy.
As we watch what's happening in the room here at the NATO summit in Washington, the seats have been filled and dignitaries, officials from the administration have made their way into the room as we see John Kirby and Karine Jean-Pierre sitting near each other in the front row, two people who have had to run defense on a daily basis for the past 2 weeks. Jake Sullivan also sitting down near the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in the front row. So we're getting close here. Network reporters are standing up, waiting for their 2-minute warning from the White House. That's typically how this works. And then we'll be off and running here. Jeannie, there's been a lot of question about duration. There was question about timing as well. This is a news conference that was scheduled to begin almost a full hour ago. If this is a president trying to project competency, what is that message for voters?
Yeah, I think we are all used to public officials, presidents, President Biden amongst them, being late. And so I don't think it will have that much of an impact. But of course, this was originally scheduled for 5:30. And if you look at social media, whether this is true or not, some of the talk is they pushed it back to make sure it didn't make the evening news because there was a fear that he may not perform well. So, all of these sort of suggestions coming into play because of the concerns about his cognitive ability and his ability to perform. And, you just mentioned some of the people in the room right now. Those, a lot of people that I feel for, particularly the staff, the campaign staff, people who work for Joe Biden, people who put their heart and soul into this, thinking he was the presumptive nominee, and now they are dealing with this, certainly something none of us expected. But for those people who are working for the campaign and working for the president, this is a heartbreaking few weeks they have gone through and really grueling. And tonight they're hoping that he's able to quell some of the unrest, but I'm not sure that anything he does is going to be able to do that at this point.
Well, and it's not just campaign staff, Jeannie. There's staff from the State Department, the Defense Department, keeping in mind here that the venue for this is the 75th anniversary of NATO, the NATO summit happening here in Washington, D.C., in which things have actually tangibly been accomplished. We had announcements of long-range air defense system, short-range as well. President Biden in a bilateral meeting with President Zelensky earlier today announced another $225 million in aid. When all that is going to be focused on here is President Biden's performance at the very end of the summit, does it do the actual geopolitical accomplishments this week a disservice if that's not what we're left talking about?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, so many things. This is a critically important moment for NATO. We all know that. We had President Zelensky there. We had all the members there. And so much of what they need to accomplish as we look towards many things, in particular the war with Russia. And yet that doesn't get the attention it deserves publicly. And of course, that public support is critical if we're going to continue as nations and allies of Ukraine to support their effort. And this is, of course, what Vladimir Putin has been banking on, that the support public would dry up, and that would result in a dry up of support in terms of weapons and money and other things Ukraine needs to fight. So this does enormous disservice in that regard. Certainly the president wants to put this to rest so he can get back to the business of doing his job as a member of NATO, as the president, as, commander-in-chief. But all of that is not getting the attention it deserves at this point. And I can't remember a moment in the modern history of our country in which so much has fallen by the wayside as one issue has commanded attention like this has. I mean, there's a few, but we haven't seen it recently. And for Joe Biden, it is falling on an issue that does him a real disservice as he tries to mount this candidacy.
Well, Rick, a lot of viewers and listeners around the world tuned in for Joe Biden almost an hour ago for what was supposed to be a great test and help them decide whether he should be running for president or not, help them make investment decisions. We're still looking at an empty podium now at almost 7:30 p.m. Is this how you project competency?
No, the understory here doesn't look that great. Of course, it'll all be explained away by the demands of the NATO summit. And there is kind of a residual benefit to it getting pushed late. I mean, the later you go, the more eyeballs on TV. You're going to break into Jeopardy soon and say, oh, well, now we're going to hear from the President of the United States. The Jeopardy audience is significantly bigger than the evening news audience that would normally be interrupted. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think they're sitting there calculating how many eyeballs they're going to get tonight, but that is actually a consequence of being late.
Does anyone care?
The later you get, the bigger the audience is going to be. So we may be here till 9 o'clock waiting for this thing to tip off.
That's what we wanted.
They could be in prime time.
Yeah, dare to dream.
Well, the debate was prime time.
Right.
Remember, it started at 9 p.m. We all know how that went down. But the conversation we were having around the debate was whether or not people were going to be paying attention. It did turn out some 50 million people watched. But we had the conversation then that actually what matters is the way in which it's circulated on social media the next day. What bites go viral? If nothing else, is that what Joe Biden needs to accomplish here? Nothing going viral for a negative reason.
Yeah, well, he's already lost that fight for tonight, right? By calling, Zelensky Putin, that has already hit the viral spread like wildfire. So I think they've already probably declared defeat on the social media wars. But that being said, hope that's the only thing for the Biden campaign, right? Hope that is overcome by what is, a good press conference. We hope that for the president and for our country, that we convey a strong executive leadership. But that being said, we saw that Stephanopoulos interview about 10 days ago. Everyone thought, wow, that's really important. And it didn't have any impact on the slide that is the Biden campaign. So I wouldn't anticipate this change the trajectory. And look, the campaign staff has been very smart. They've now obviously set another anchor in place for Monday night for an evening news discussion. Yeah. So, if we don't get past this, we're going to promise everybody it'll be better on Monday. And so at some point, you got to call the cards. Everybody has to say, OK, enough of this, right? We're not going to actually worry about another chance to be better. We have to deal with what we have today.
Well, as the world waits here, Jeanne, if this is not a flex to show he can stay up and perform after 8 p.m., one would be led to believe that he is actually still talking with world leaders, still dealing with some pretty heady business behind that stage or in that conference center somewhere here as part of the NATO summit. It appears we just got our 2-minute warning, which helps us understand when this is going to begin, Jeanne. But that could be a very distracting moment, is my point, for Joe Biden, right before he's shot out of a cannon onto the world stage here. Are you concerned that he might not be in the right frame of mind for this, coming out of intense discussions all day with the likes of President Zelensky and others?
Absolutely. And it makes you question the fact that they are doing this press conference now. But of course, they are also the ones who called for the debate that didn't serve him particularly well. So, these are big questions. The man's had a long day. Why do this now? So, maybe they know something we don't. I hope he has taken a few minutes to rest and think about what he's going to say, because reporters are rightly frustrated. And I think he's going to get some very, very tough and pointed questions, and the world is going to be watching to see if he can indeed answer them in a coherent way, and if they think he has the energy and the stamina to do this job, not just tonight, but for 4 more years.
Mm-hmm.
All right, as we await here literally any second now, Joe Biden, the president of the United States, going to the podium to address members of the press. Rick, if you had the first question, what would it be?
Are you prepared to release the results of all of your physicals related to cognitive capability and age-related problems? Mr. President, do you have Parkinson's?
Wow. Direct.
They do have an answer to that, at least as we've heard from the press secretary. We should note that there are teleprompter panels set up near this podium. We've been referring to this as an unscripted news conference, but the president is, as we typically see in any event like this, going to deliver some opening remarks. President Biden is walking out on the stage right now. This is live from Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, good evening. We just concluded this year's NATO summit. And the consensus among the members was it was a great success. It was especially momentous because it represented the 75th year of the most important military defense alliance in the world's history of the world. We should never forget that NATO grew out of the wreckage of World War II, the most destructive war in history. The idea was to create an alliance of free and democratic nations that would commit themselves to a compact of collective defense. Standing together, they knew we'd all be safer. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And it's worked because a would-be aggressor knows if they attack one of us, they'll be attacked by all of us. Sending that message is the best way to deter aggression and prevent wars in the first place. For those who thought NATO's time had passed, they got a rude awakening when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of the oldest and deepest fears in Europe roared back to life because once again, a murderous madman was on the march. But this time, no one cowered in appeasement, especially the United States. We collected intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine months before the invasion. I directed the intelligence community to be a significant amount of intelligence be declassified so I could start building an international coalition to oppose the invasion. Then in February, some of you remember, I warned the world that the invasion was imminent. I rallied a coalition of 50 nations from Europe to Asia to help Ukraine defend itself. Many foreign policy experts thought, as Putin amassed Russian forces just 100 miles north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but Putin thought it was the mother home of Russia. The capital would fall in less than a week. But the Ukrainian people, backed by a coalition to help build, stopped them. Today, Kyiv still stands, and NATO stands stronger than it has ever been. During the week of this summit, several heads of states made it a point in their statements to thank the United States and to thank me personally for all that NATO has achieved. NATO is not only stronger, NATO is bigger because we led the charge to bring in Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and it makes a gigantic difference. Excuse me. Meanwhile, my predecessor has made it clear he has no commitment to NATO. He's made it clear that he would feel no obligation to honor Article 5. He's already told Putin, and I quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." In fact, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine, here's what he said. It was genius. It was wonderful. Some of you forgot that, but that's exactly what he said. But I made it clear a strong NATO is essential to American security. And I believe the obligation of Article 5 is sacred. And I would remind all Americans, Article 5 is invoked only once in NATO's long history, and that was to defend America after 9/11. I made it clear that I will not bow down to Putin. I will not walk away from Ukraine. I will keep NATO strong. That's exactly what we did, and exactly what we'll continue to do. Now, the future of American policy is up to the American people. This is much more than a political question. It's more than that. It's a national security issue. Don't reduce this to the usual testament. that people talk about, issues of being a political campaign. It's far too important. It's about the world we live in for decades to come. Every American must ask herself or himself, is the world safer with NATO? Are you safer? Is your family safer? I believe the American people know the answer to all those questions is yes. And I believe the American people understand that America is stronger because of our alliances. I believe the American consensus from Truman to Reagan to me still holds today. America cannot retreat from the world. We must lead the world. We are an indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright wrote. Now let me turn to 3 other key issues. Just this morning, we had a great economic report showing inflation is down. Overall prices fell last month. Core inflation is the lowest it's been in 3 years. Prices are falling for cars, appliances, and airfares. Grocery prices have fallen since the start of the year. We're going to keep working to take down corporate greed to bring those prices down further. Meanwhile, Trump's calling for a 10% tariff on everything Americans buy, including food from overseas, vegetables, and other necessities. And economists tell us that that would cost the average American working family another $2,500 a year. It's a tax of $2,500 a year. Second, our efforts to secure the border, the southern border, is working. After Trump killed the bipartisan effort to secure the border, Republicans and Democrats had worked on, because he thought it would benefit me and make him a loser, Republicans walked away. So I took executive action last month. As a consequence, working with Mexico, border encounters have gone down over 50%. The current level is lower today than when Trump left office. Third, for months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close. We're making progress. The trend is positive, and I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now. Let me conclude where I began. We're the United States of America. We are the indispensable nation. Our leadership matters. Our partnerships matter. This moment matters. We must rise to meet it. With that, I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president until I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish. There's so much, we've made so much progress. Think about it. Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million jobs. So things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. Their prices, the corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down. And so I'm optimistic about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, and the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. Officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was. Next one, Nancy Korte, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned there are instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward, can't do that, it's going to cause inflation, things are going to skyrocket, the debt's going to go up. What are you hearing now from mainstream economists? 16 economic Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job. That under my plans so far and what's going to happen in the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is I decided to was able to implement as president what I believed when I was a senator. And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an economist, a mainstream economist, who said we haven't done well. What have we not done that isn't working right now? And so we got more to do, though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not anti-corporate, but corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic, doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase. Corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union, not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry was in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there, and import what the product was. And so what did I do? I was told not to go over to Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world and you have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is we've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming in the bean. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen. But it's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies. All through, and by the way, red states and blue states. Manufacturers as much in red states as in blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fairer. And like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well. But the wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
As a follow-up, sir, you mentioned that your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you look at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I have, I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events. Some with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to just pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before. Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time. At the very end, I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway, I'm sorry, Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that. How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We've allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near or abroad, into Russia. Whether or not he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not. If he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, and the weaponry we're getting to him? I've gotten a more long-range capacity, as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is where I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should and shouldn't go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or it's a matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. Who I got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look, I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving?
I'm not having any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. He'd be a disaster. He'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you from Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine, that that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine. I said, you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. No, that's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me? In my office, I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did. It wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. I beg your pardon? And so Finland joined NATO, 800-mile border is a significant, and they were already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe, I can't recall whether he said it publicly in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind it being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. And we're able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States. We're making the world safer and stronger because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it, and we're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where is it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi, that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit, and others raised, the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do, what they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating them. They're getting access to additional. They're not supplying weapons themselves. They're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that Xi believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we have to make clear. China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that, remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between Xi and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that Xi understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so for example, if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well, want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules, and you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.
Interrupt that impact?
Yes, I do, but I'm not prepared to talk about the detail of it in public. And I think you'll see that some of our European friends are going to be curtailing their investment in in China, as long as China continues to have this indirect help to Russia in terms of being able to help their economy as well as help them in, as a consequence of that, their ability to fight in Ukraine. The other thing that we talked a lot about is that, and I raised it, and I didn't hear any. I can't swear that everyone agreed because not everyone got to talk about it, but we need a new industrial policy in the West. For example, we talked about how both the EU as well as NATO has to be able to begin to build their own munition capacity, has to be able to generate their own capacity to provide for weapons and the ability to. It came as a surprise to some of us how we had fallen behind in the West in terms of the ability to construct new material, new weaponry, new everything from vehicles to weapon systems. And so one of the things that came out of this was we're going to be meeting again with a number of my colleagues, my European colleagues, is what do we do to increase the capacity of the West, particularly in Europe and Japan, to be able to generate the kind of ability to produce their own weapon systems. Not just for themselves, but to be able to generate that. It's the same, it's what Russia's trying to figure out. That they went to China and they didn't get the weapons, but then they went to North Korea. But we're going to be in a position where the West is going to become the industrial base for it to be able to, the ability to have all the defensive weapons that we need. That was a discussion as well.
Mr. President, I'm not sure you answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now. Look, like I said, I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior. But there isn't any world leader I'm not prepared to deal with. But I understand the generic point is Putin ready to talk? I'm not ready to talk to Putin unless Putin's ready to change his behavior. And the idea, look, Putin's got a problem. First of all, in this war that he is supposedly have won, and by the way, I think, don't hold me to the exact number, but I think that Russia had 17.3% of Ukraine that they've conquered. Now it's 17.4%. I mean, in terms of percentage of territory. They've not been very successful. They've caused horrible damage, loss of life, but they've also lost over 350,000 troops, military, killed or wounded. They have over 1 million people, particularly young people with technical capability, leaving Russia because they see no future there. They've got a problem. But what they do have control of is they are very good at controlling and running the public outcry that relates to how they use mechanisms to communicate with people. They lie like hell to the constituencies. They lie like hell about what's going on. And so the idea that we're going to be able to fundamentally change Russia in the near term is not likely. But one thing for certain, if we allow Russia to succeed in Ukraine, they're not stopping in Ukraine. I recommend, I know you know this because you've written about it, read Putin's speech after they moved in, what it was all about in Kyiv. It wasn't about just, anyway, read what his objective is. And anyway, but so I think that I'm prepared to talk to any leader who wants to talk, including if Putin called me and wanted to talk. Last time I talked to Putin was trying to get him to work on an arms control agreement related to nuclear weapons in space. That didn't go very far. So my point is, I'm prepared to talk to anybody, but I don't see any inclination. There is an inclination on the part of the Chinese to keep in contact with me because they're not sure where this all goes. And look what's happened in Asia. we have strengthened the Asian Pacific area more than anyone else has. We just put together today, I asked our NATO allies that we bring on the group from the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. I already mentioned Australia. And I met twice now, I think, with the 14 leaders of the Pacific Island nations. And we've slowed down what's going on there. We've slowed down China's reach. But there's a lot of work to do. This is a moving target, and I don't take it lightly. Sam from NPR.
Thank you, Mr. President. Asma Khalid with NPR. I have two questions. Earlier, you spoke about the ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. We're now looking at 10 months of war, and I'm curious if there's anything that you feel personally you wish you would have done differently over the course of the war. And then secondly, if I may, I wanted to ask you about your presidential campaign. I remember covering your campaign in 2020, and there was a moment where you referred to yourself as a, quote, bridge candidacy, a transition to a younger generation of leaders. I want to understand what changed.
Two things. Let's go back to when you talked about would I have changed anything that's happening with Israel and the Palestinians and the Palestinian movement. The answer is, as you recall, from the very beginning, I went to Israel, but I also got immediate contact with al-Sisi in Egypt. I met with the King of Jordan. I met with most of the Arab leaders to try to get a consensus going as to what had to be done to deal with getting more aid and food and medicine into the Gaza Strip. And we pushed it really hard. And Israel occasionally was less than cooperative, number one. The Israeli War Cabinet, I've been dealing with Israel since Golda Meir. Some of the reporters around here come me all the time have heard me say this. The first time I met with Golda Meir, I sat across from her at her desk, and her assistant was Rabin sitting next to me. That's how far back I go. I know Israel well, and I support Israel. But this war cabinet is one of the most conservative war cabinets in the history of Israel. And there's no ultimate answer other than a two-state solution here. And so what was able to be done in terms of the plan I put together was it would be a process for a two-state solution. And we get the Arab nations to, particularly from Egypt all the way to Saudi Arabia, to be in a position where they would cooperate in the transition so that they could keep the peace in Gaza without Israeli forces staying in Gaza. The question has been from the beginning, what's the day after in Gaza? And the day after in Gaza has to be, the end of the day after has to be no occupation by Israel and the Gaza Strip, as well as the ability for us to get in and out as rapidly as you can, all that's needed there. I've been disappointed that some of the things that I've put forward have not succeeded as well, like the port we attached from Cyprus. I was hopeful that would be more successful. But that's why when I went to Israel immediately after the massacres that occurred at the hands of Hamas, the one thing I said to the Israelis, and I met with the War Cabinet and with Bibi, don't make the same mistake America made after bin Laden. There's no need to occupy anywhere. Go after the people who did the job. You may recall, I still get criticized for it, but I was totally opposed to the occupation and trying to unite Afghanistan. Once we got bin Laden, we should have moved on, because it was not no one's ever going to unite that country. I've been over every inch of that, not every inch, the entirety from the poppy fields all the way to the north. I said, don't make the same mistake we made. Don't think that's what you should be doing, is doubling down. We'll help you find the bad guys, Sinwar and company. And all this criticism about I wouldn't provide when the weapons they needed. I'm not providing them 2,000-pound bombs. They cannot be used in Gaza or any populated area without causing great human tragedy and damage. But remember what happened when you had the attack on Israel with rockets and ballistic missiles. I was able to unite the Arab nations as well as Europe, and nothing happened. Nothing got hurt. It sent an incredible lesson to what was going on from the Middle East. So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. But the bottom line is we have a chance now. It's time to end this war. Doesn't mean walk away from going after Sinwar and Hamas. And if you notice, you know better than most, there is a growing dissatisfaction on the West Bank from the Palestinians about Hamas. Hamas is not popular now. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I just have to keep moving to make sure that we get as much done as we can toward a ceasefire, and get those. And by the way, look at the numbers in Israel. I mean, my numbers are better in Israel than they are here. But then again, they're better than a lot of other people here too. But anyway.
Bridge candidacy in 2020, you referred to yourself as being a bridge candidate for a younger, fresher generation of Democratic leaders, and I wanted to know what changed.
What changed was the gravity of the situation I inherited in terms of the economy, our foreign policy, and domestic division. And I think, I won't put words in anybody's mouth, most presidential historians give me credit for having accomplished more than most any president since Johnson and maybe before that to get major pieces of legislation passed. And what I realized was my long time in the Senate had equipped me to have the wisdom to know how to deal with the Congress to get things done. We got more major legislation passed that no one thought would happen. And I want to finish it, to get that finished. If tomorrow, if we had a circumstance where there was a lineup and I hadn't inherited what I did and we just moved things along, anyway, it's going to change.
Last question.
Haley Bull, Scripps. Or no, Josh Weingrove, I'm sorry, was the next one. I'll do two more questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Many of your colleagues, Democrats on the Hill, are watching tonight as they assess what they want to say about your candidacy. I'm wondering how you're thinking of this right now. It seems like your answer is clear, but they're watching how things go tonight, tomorrow in Michigan, next week in Texas and Nevada. Are you thinking that way about how the next week or two goes would inform your...
Am I using that way, you said?
Are you thinking that way about how the next 2 weeks go? Will that affect your decision, or are you fully determined on running in November as the party's nominee?
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events from Wisconsin to North Carolina to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win, where we can persuade people to move our way, or people are already there. And here, look, the other thing is, we have the most extensive campaign organization of anybody's had in a long, long time. We have well over 1,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, making tens of thousands of phone calls. We have headquarters. I forget exactly how many. I don't want to cite a number and then find out I'm off. But we have scores of headquarters in all the toss-up states. We're organized. We're moving. And that's awful hard to replace in the near term. And here's the other thing. I was in the Senate a long time. Very proud of what I've done in the Senate. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for a long time, and I was chairman or ranking member and chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I'm going to be going down to the Johnson Library. Anyway, I'm going to be going around making the case of the things that I think we have to finish and how we can't afford to lose what we've done or backslide on civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights. There's that little button we have. Control guns, not girls. I mean, the idea we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around. More children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We got a candidate saying, promised the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. You got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous. There's so much we can do still, and I'm determined to get it done. It's about freedom. And by the way, I'll end this. Well, I'm not going to do that. Haley has to come up too. But I remember I made a speech on democracy in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. And I'm not being critical, just observing. The bulk of the press said, what the hell is he talking about that for? Democracy. You did. Democracy is not an issue. Democracy is not an issue. Except the polling data showed 60% of the people knew I was right, thought I was right. I'm not asking you a question. You don't have to answer, obviously. But do you think our democracy is under siege based on this court? Do you think democracy is under siege based on Project 2025? Do you think he means what he says when he says he's going to do away with the civil service, eliminate the Department of Education, make sure, we've never been here before. And that's the other reason why you say, hand off to another generation. I've got to finish this job. I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake.
We've had some discussions over the past few days with your press secretary about the question of health exams. And you said you take a cognitive test every day in this job. Are you open to taking another physical or test before the election? Governor Whitmer of Michigan, for instance, said it wouldn't hurt to take a test.
Well, look, two things. One, I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity to do decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember when the staff and I said, I'm going to go to South Korea, we're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand it. You know, the only thing age does is help you with it, creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention. And so the point I'm making is, I think it's important that if the neurologist tells me he thinks I need another exam, and by the way, I've laid every bit of the record out, hadn't hidden a thing. You ought to ask Trump for his, okay? I laid it all out. And every single day I'm surrounded by good docs. If they think there's a problem, I promise you, or even if they don't think it's a problem, they think I should have a neurological exam again, I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now. And I'll ask you another question. No matter what I did, no one's going to be satisfied. Did you have 7 docs? Did you have 2? Who'd you have? Did you do this? How many times did you? So I am not opposed. If my doctors tell me I should have another neurological exam, I'll do it. But that's where I am. Haley Bull, Scripps.
Thank you, Mr. President. You said you're making decisions on a day-to-day basis when it comes to support for Ukraine. Does that mean you have not closed the door on further considering lifting restrictions for U.S.-made weapons inside Russia? And if I may, your convention is coming up where your delegates are pledged to make you the official nominee. If they have second thoughts, are they free to vote their conscience?
Obviously, they're free to do whatever they want, but I get overwhelming support. Overwhelming support. I won, I forget how many votes I won in the primary. Overwhelming. And so tomorrow, if all of a sudden I show up at the convention, everybody says, we want somebody else, that's the democratic process. It's not going to happen.
Even if that means they vote for someone else?
Sure. Look, I'll end this with this. I served in the Senate a long time. I understand the impetus of candidates running for local office and whether they think the topic can help them or not. In my state of Delaware, which was a very, at least it was a red state when I started, in terms of where you now talk red and blue. I don't recall most of the Democratic presidents winning my state when I was a candidate. The truth of the matter is I understand the self-interest of a candidate. If they think that, running with Biden at the top is going to hurt them, then they're going to run away. I get it. But so far, go and look at the polling data in their states. Look at the in-depth, and by the way, I think you'd all acknowledge, and you're all experts. I'm not being solicitous about the president. You're experts on this stuff. How accurate does anybody think the polls are these days? I can give you a series of polls where you have likely voters, me versus Trump, where I win all the time. When the unlikely voters vote, he wins sometimes. The bottom line is all the polling data right now, which I think is premature because the campaign really hasn't even started. I mean, it hadn't started in earnest yet. Most of the time, it doesn't start till after September, after Labor Day. So a lot can happen. But I think I'm the best I believe I'm the best qualified to govern. And I think I'm the best qualified to win. But there are other people who could beat Trump too. But it's awful start from scratch. And, we talk about, money raised. We're not doing bad. We got about $220 million in the bank. We're doing well. So with that, you have any want to follow up on any of that you just asked me?
Yes. You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that. Okay. Thank you.
This ends tonight's press conference. Thanks, everybody. This concludes.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
This concludes tonight's press conference. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
President Biden ending his press conference here in Washington at the NATO summit. It lasted almost a full hour, answering a range of questions, much of it focused, in fact, on foreign policy, given the venue that it was at the NATO summit. Ukraine, China, even Israel were discussed. But as expected, many questions faced by President Biden about his age and whether or not he is still going to remain in this race. He told Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove, "I am determined on running. I think it's important that I allay fears that they see me out there." But Joe Matthew, he said, "There's still so much we can do. I'm determined to get it done." And at the very end of that press conference that we were just listening to live on Bloomberg TV and radio, he said that unless polls come back and say there's no way you can win, no one is saying that. No poll says that. That is how the president decided to end his remarks today. The question now is going to be, were any minds changed by the last hour?
He questioned the accuracy of those polls, which we talk about every day here, Kayleigh, on Balance of Power, and made clear that he was in this not for his legacy, but to complete the job that he started. He came back to that line. It's something clearly that they had worked on before he delivered his words tonight to say, "I've got to finish the job." But he did, in speaking with our own Josh Wingrove, acknowledge the fact he's taken 3, as he referred to, significant and intense neurological exams. He said his left foot is still sensitive. So many people talk about the gait, the way that he walks. He said because he didn't wear a boot after he broke his ankle. More importantly, went on to say he is not opposed to another neurological exam if his neurologist tells him that. Tried to throw a sense of humor. We saw him smile a few times during those remaining questions. Kayleigh, I have to admit it, he seemed to save the best for last. He was getting amped up, more animated, more direct with his answers toward the end of that hour-long affair.
Yeah, and indeed, it did last for some time. He answered a litany of questions from reporters. We have not seen him do something like this, frankly, in years, since after the midterms in November of 2022. Back with us now to react to what we have just seen from President Biden on Bloomberg TV and radio, Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner, and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Jeanne, as the Democrat, I need to come to you first. Did he do the job that he needed to do? What was accomplished tonight? Did it change any minds?
I don't think it's going to change any minds. I think it underscores the really difficult task he has ahead of him and what he was facing tonight. He gave really good, in-depth answers on complicated foreign policy. And yet what is going to stick in people's minds are the gaffes. Zelensky, Putin, Donald Trump, Harris, and a few others. The repetitions he made, the way he trailed off in questions. He is good on national security. He knows this business. It's a comfort zone for him. And yet I'm not sure it's going to have any impact on those people who are calling for him to drop out or change minds of people who are saying that he is too old to serve as president and looking for somebody younger and looking to a future Democratic candidate.
Rick, it was a 59-minute-long conversation. Some of his answers were very long. It was very heavy in foreign policy for Americans sitting on their couch trying to figure out what this meant for domestic politics. He did meander in some cases. He had to stop himself in others. Became much more animated to the end of this news conference when a lot of people may have already tuned out. Could he have hurt himself tonight? What's your read?
It's interesting to see what people will come out with. I agree with you. I thought he talked in a competent fashion about a myriad of foreign policy, mainly foreign policy issues, national security issues, and he used the immense amount of experience he has, having been in public life for over 60 years, to his benefit this time. But it was competency, but not what I would call convincing. He did it in a conversational way. These weren't talking points focused on making a hard punch on the issue or defining his next 4 years in the presidency. It was almost like he was just being thoughtful and in a very conversational way laid out, as Jeanne said, complicated issues. I think the key thing for me was there was never one instance where he really addressed the issue that was at stake tonight, and that was his age and his competency. He kept talking about his experience. It's like his resume, right? Look at all the things I've done. And every time he was asked about his age, he talked about his experience. And he never really dealt with the pressing issue. There was no moment of clarity where he said, look, I understand. I'm 81 years old. And I can deal with it because. And I think that's what everybody was tuning in for. And they did not get it tonight.
Well, I'd like to point out that as we talk about the extent to which Joe Biden was leaning on his experience with foreign policy and national security, the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Jim Himes, moments after President Biden wrapped up that news conference, puts out a statement saying he should not risk his legacy. He says, I hope President Biden will step away from the presidential campaign. He goes on to say the 2024 election will define the future of American democracy, and we must put forth the strongest candidate possible to confront the threat posed by Trump. Jeanne, how many other Democratic members of the House, or the Senate for that matter, do you expect could follow Congressman Himes?
I think we are going to see numerous follow. I'm so glad you raised that, Kayleigh, because it is, just stunning the timing on this. Jim Himes is a careful guy. He knows the stakes here, but he is reflecting what so many Democrats feel, which is that Donald Trump is very close now to the White House again, and Democrats are very close to losing the House once again and potentially losing the Senate. And to have an entirely Republican Washington, D.C. is really a nightmare scenario for Democrats. And so I think we are going to see more follow. There isn't a path they feel for Joe Biden to beat Donald Trump at this point, and they risk losing Congress.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, thank you so much for staying with us for the duration this evening. This has been Bloomberg TV and Radio's special coverage of President Biden's news conference. We'll see you back here tomorrow.